My husband had been resting in the frozen ground for exactly 2 hours when his son locked me out in a sub-zero blizzard. He looked at me through a narrow crack in the heavy oak door of our farmhouse, told me I was never really family, and left me on the porch to freeze. He thought he had just executed the perfect hostile takeover. He thought he had claimed a highly profitable North Dakota agricultural estate for himself and his new wife. He looked at my shivering shoulders and saw a defeated, grieving widow who would simply walk away into the snow and disappear from his life forever. What he did not know was that decades of working as an agricultural auditor had taught me to read the fine print before I ever signed my name to anything. I spent my entire career hunting down discrepancies, finding the hidden numbers that arrogant men thought they had buried. He was so busy plotting his grand eviction, scheduling the locksmiths, and rehearsing his cruel little speeches that he never bothered to drive down to the county clerk office and pull the actual property records. If he had taken 5 minutes to do his homework, he would have realized the deed to this land had my name on it first. Before my husband, before him. Mine. Farms out here in the Midwest are not just pieces of land. They are living, breathing entities built on blood, sweat, and generations of back-breaking labor. When you try to steal a legacy like that, you better make sure your paperwork is flawless. Travis thought his bloodline gave him an automatic crown. He thought the law would simply bow to his greed. He underestimated the biting cold of a North Dakota winter, but more importantly, he underestimated me. I did not build my life by running away when things got hard. My name is Melody Wood. I am 58 years old. Today I stood on an icy wooden porch, listening to the brass deadbolt slide shut, realizing my stepson had just handed me the exact tools I needed to legally dismantle his entire life, piece by piece. If you have ever had to outsmart an arrogant relative who mistook your quiet kindness for weakness, tell me your age in the comments below. Welcome to Samantha Told Stories. Hit the like button and subscribe because you are not going to want to miss a single second of this reckoning. The wind howling across the Great Plains carried a biting sting that felt like crushed glass against my skin. The drive back from the cemetery had been a blur of gray skies and blowing snow. I had driven my own truck, insisting on a few moments of quiet isolation after the lowering of the casket. The pastor words about Calvin finding eternal peace felt hollow against the biting reality of my newly empty passenger seat. Calvin had been a good man, a hard-working farmer who loved the land more than anything else. He loved Travis, too, but he always knew his son had a reckless, entitled streak. I just never realized how deep that entitlement ran until today. I stood on the welcome mat, my fingers clumsy and numb, trying to force my house key into the front door. It refused to turn. The cylinder was not just stuck, the internal mechanism felt entirely hollow. I pulled the key back and looked down. Tiny, glittering brass shavings caught the dim glow of the porch light, resting softly on the woven fabric of the mat. Someone had drilled out the locks. I was still wearing the thin black dress and the light wool peacoat I had worn to the cemetery. The North Dakota winter was unforgiving, and the temperature was rapidly dropping below zero as the pale sun dipped behind the jagged horizon of the Badlands. I shivered, pulled my collar tight against my neck, and knocked on the solid oak. I expected silence. Instead, the door swung open just a few inches. The warm, familiar scent of cinnamon and wood smoke drifted out from the entryway, wrapping around me for a fleeting second before the cold pushed it away. Travis stood in the doorway. At 32 years old, my stepson wore a dark suit that stretched too tight across his shoulders. His posture was rigid. His expression was a practiced mask of stone. There were no red eyes, no signs of tears. He did not look like a man who had just buried his father. He looked like a man guarding a vault. Behind him, hovering near the base of the staircase, stood his wife, Natalie. She had her arms folded over her chest, wearing a soft gray cashmere sweater and a woven burgundy scarf. My throat tightened. That was my scarf. Calvin had bought it for me in Bismarck 2 winters ago. Natalie refused to meet my eyes, shifting her weight and staring intently at the hardwood floor. Seeing it draped over Natalie's shoulders felt like a physical violation. It was an announcement that they were not just taking the house, they were taking my history. "Travis," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the chattering of my teeth. "The key is not working." "I know," Travis replied. His voice held no grief. It held a hollow, rehearsed tone of authority. "I had a commercial crew come out while we were at the cemetery." The brass shavings on the mat suddenly made sense. While I was standing over his father's grave watching the casket lower into the frozen earth, Travis was paying a locksmith emergency cash to strip my home. I took a slow breath, letting the icy air fill my lungs. I need to get inside. My blood pressure medication is on the kitchen counter, and it is freezing out here. Travis filled the doorframe, blocking any trace of the heat radiating from the hallway. "This is my father's house, Melody. It is mine now. You were never real family, and I am not letting you squat here." The audacity of his words hung suspended in the frigid air. I did not scream. I did not cry. Decades of auditing farm ledgers and tracking missing inventory had trained me to process raw data before allowing myself to react. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to become the hysterical, grieving stepmother so he could justify his cruelty. I looked past him, focusing on the brass coat rack in the hall. "I just buried your father," I stated, my tone flat and analytical. "Give me my winter coat and my pills. Talk to my lawyer," Travis said. He did not even flinch. His eyes were dark and hard, lacking any trace of human empathy. He stepped back, the hinges groaning in the cold, and pushed the heavy door shut. The brass deadbolt engaged with a resonant final click. The porch light flicked off, leaving me in the encroaching dark. The wind howled louder, biting right through my sheer tights. I turned away from the house and looked down the long gravel driveway toward my pickup truck. It was parked near the edge of the barren fields. I told myself to stay calm. I would just walk to the truck, turn up the heater, and put on my heavy canvas survival gear. Every person who lived through a Midwestern winter kept an emergency kit stowed behind the seat. Thermal blankets, flares, a heavy coat, hand warmers. I crunched through the snow, the thin soles of my dress shoes offering no protection against the ice. My hands shook as I pulled the heavy metal handle of the truck door. I climbed into the freezing cab, my breath pluming in the dark interior. I reached my hand behind the driver's seat, expecting to feel the rough, familiar canvas of my winter coat. My fingers grasped empty air. I turned around, my heart thumping against my ribs. The space behind the seats was bare. The duffel bag was gone. The thermal blankets were gone. Even the plastic ice scraper was missing. A memory flashed in my mind, sharp and clear. 3 days ago, Travis had shown up at the house playing the role of the dutiful son. He offered to clean my truck for the funeral procession, saying I had enough on my mind. He asked for the keys and spent an hour in the driveway. He had not just vacuumed the floorboards. He had systematically stripped the cab of every piece of survival equipment I owned. The dashboard clock glowed a pale green, reading 4 in the afternoon. In North Dakota, winter darkness falls fast and heavy. The temperature gauge on the console read -5 and it was still dropping. Without my heavy jacket, the ambient cold of the truck cab felt like a physical weight pressing against my chest. I rubbed my hands together, trying to generate some friction, blowing hot air into my cupped palms. I sat in the freezing darkness, gripping the icy steering wheel. Travis had not just locked me out of a house during a property dispute. He had calculated the dropping temperature. He had removed my physical defenses. He had intentionally left me stranded in a lethal frost, hoping the bitter cold would do his dirty work for him. He wanted me broken, or he wanted me dead. I stared through the frost-covered windshield at the silhouette of my own house. The warm yellow glow of the living room lights spilled out onto the snow-covered lawn. They were inside, walking on my hardwood floors, sitting on my leather sofa, probably pouring themselves a drink from Calvin liquor cabinet to toast their clever little victory. They thought they had won. My blood pressure throbbed behind my eyes, a dull, steady ache, reminding me that my medication was sitting exactly where I left it, next to the coffee maker. Travis knew my medical history. He knew about my hypertension. Taking my emergency kit was not just an act of theft. It was an act of endangerment. My grief evaporated, replaced by a cold, precise clarity. I turned the key in the ignition. The engine sputtered, protested against the cold, and finally roared to life. I reached out to the vents, waiting for the slow, meager warmth of the heater to start blowing. I had survived harsh winters my entire life. I knew how to wait out a storm. Travis thought he was playing a game of inheritance. He had no idea he had just declared war on a woman who kept the receipts for everything. The heater in the Ford pickup was never designed to sustain life overnight. It was built to warm your hands during a 20-minute drive into town or thaw the windshield before a morning haul. I sat in the driver's seat, watching my breath turn into thick white fog against the glass. The cold out here on the plains is not merely a temperature. It operates like a physical weight pressing against your ribs and forcing its way deep into your joints. I had to ration the remaining gas carefully since the gauge hovered just above a quarter tank. I developed a grim, methodical rhythm. Run the engine for 20 minutes until the vents pushed out a fragile, lukewarm breeze. Turn the ignition off. Wait an hour while the frost crept back up the edges of the windshield like jagged crystal webs. Repeat the cycle. My toes went numb first, losing all sensation inside my thin dress shoes. Then the ache settled into my fingers. I tucked my hands tightly under my arms and pulled my knees to my chest, staring at the dark silhouette of the farmhouse. During the long, silent stretches when the engine was off, the quiet of the fields became deafening. The wind would die down for a few minutes, leaving a void so vast it made my ears ring. To keep panic at bay, my mind drifted, trying to find warmth in old memories. The frost on the glass blurred, and suddenly, I was standing in a dusty legal office in downtown Fargo. It was the late summer of 1998. The small room smelled of stale roasted coffee and polished leather. My uncle sat across a heavy mahogany desk, holding a thick stack of papers. He handed me a silver fountain pen and tapped the bottom line of the final page. "This land stays in our blood, Melody," he said, his voice rough from years of breathing grain dust. "You take care of the dirt, and the dirt will take care of you." Years later, Calvin and I sat at our kitchen table drinking hot black tea while a heavy snow fell outside the bay window. We had been married for 2 years by then. He reached across the scratched oak surface and placed his calloused hand over mine. "Keep the deed solely in your name, Mel. Farms do terrible things to families when money gets tight." He knew his son even back then. Calvin loved Travis deeply, but he recognized the entitlement taking root in the boy. Calvin spent his days repairing tractors and balancing seed costs, while Travis always sought the fastest route to $1. My husband understood that if the estate ever fell into dispute, his son would not honor a handshake or a promise. That conversation felt like a distant dream now, but the warning echoed loud and clear in the freezing cab of my truck. A sharp, sudden buzz vibrating against my thigh snapped me back to the freezing present. My phone illuminated the dark interior, casting a harsh blue glow over the dashboard. The screen displayed a single incoming message from Travis. There was no text attached, just an image file. I swiped the screen and clicked the thumbnail. It was a photograph, taken in terrible overhead lighting, showing a wrinkled piece of paper resting on my own kitchen counter. The bold heading at the top read, "Last Will and Testament." My eyes scanned the blurry type, straining to read the paragraphs in the dark. The document claimed to revoke all prior agreements and leave the entirety of the property, the mineral rights, and the equipment exclusively to Travis Wood. He sent it to break my spirit. He wanted me sitting in the dark, shivering, and believing that my husband had betrayed me during his final days. He wanted me to feel foolish and defeated. But Travis forgot who he was dealing with. My vision was swimming from sheer exhaustion, but my analytical mind remained sharp. I zoomed in on the signature line at the bottom of the page. The ink was a dark blue. The date was stamped near the bottom left corner. I did not cry. A strange, clarifying calm washed over my freezing body. As an agricultural auditor, I spent 3 decades examining crop insurance claims and equipment depreciations. I knew how to spot a fraudulent ledger from across a room. Calvin always signed his name with a distinct left-handed slant, pressing the pen hard enough to indent the paper. The signature in the photo was smooth, upright, and hesitant. Furthermore, the date listed next to the signature was a Tuesday from 3 weeks ago. I knew exactly where Calvin was on that specific Tuesday. He was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to an intravenous drip, suffering from severe hand tremors. He could not even hold a paper cup of water that day, let alone sign a binding legal document with pristine penmanship. I locked the phone screen and placed the device in my cup holder. Travis was not just a greedy heir throwing his weight around. By fabricating that piece of paper, he had crossed a very dangerous legal line. The sun finally breached the horizon, painting the Badlands in pale shades of lavender and bruised orange. The morning light offered no warmth. The dashboard thermometer hovered near 10 below zero. My joints ached fiercely as I pushed the heavy truck door open and stepped onto the packed snow. The morning air hit my lungs like swallowed ice, forcing me to take shallow, careful breaths. I needed to stretch my legs to force the blood back into my extremities. I walked slowly around the rear bumper, staring toward the main house. The windows were dark and still. Travis and Natalie were probably sleeping soundly, wrapped in my heavy down comforters, ignorant of the cold reality outside. As I turned my gaze away from the house and toward the large metal equipment barn, something unusual caught my eye. The fresh snow from yesterday afternoon had blanketed the yard in a pristine white layer, but deep, wide indentations disrupted the smooth surface near the gravel access road. I walked closer, my thin soles crunching softly against the frozen crust. These were not the familiar tracks of Calvin's old pickup truck. They were not from the utility tractor either. I stared down at the impressions, analyzing the tread depth and the width of the axle span. Dual tire marks. Deep, heavy, aggressive treads spanning wide across the path. They belonged to a commercial flatbed truck, the specific kind used to haul heavy industrial machinery. The tracks led directly from the highway up to the padlocked corrugated doors of the equipment barn, and then curved back out toward the county road. A flatbed truck had no business pulling onto our property, especially not on the day of a funeral. We had no scheduled deliveries. We were not shipping any grain. I crouched down, tracing the frozen ridge of the tire mark with my bare, stiff finger. The implications of those tracks struck me harder than the winter wind. Inside that metal barn, Calvin kept a fortune in machinery. 2 newer John Deere combines, a massive seeder, and specialized tilling equipment. Together, the hardware was worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. You do not bring a commercial hauler onto a farm unless you are planning to move something very heavy and very expensive. My grief receded, entirely pushed aside by a cold, calculating logic. Travis was not merely acting out of misplaced entitlement. A man who locks his stepmother in the cold might do it out of spite. But a man who brings a commercial equipment hauler onto the farm the moment his father goes into the ground is operating on a highly specific timeline. He was moving fast. He needed something inside that barn, and he needed to liquidate it immediately. To arrange a hauler on the day of a funeral meant premeditation. He had been planning this while Calvin was still breathing in the hospice wing. I stood up, wiping the snow from my knees. The uncontrollable shivering stopped. The vulnerability of the dark night vanished, leaving behind a hardened, impenetrable shell. Travis thought he had evicted a helpless widow. He failed to realize he had just locked an auditor out in the cold, giving her the distance she needed to inspect the perimeter. He handed me the evidence of a forged document and left a physical trail of his true intentions right in the snow. I walked back to my truck and climbed inside. I did not turn the key in the ignition right away. I sat in the driver's seat staring at the farmhouse and formulating a sequence of operations. The first phase of mere survival was over. I knew what I possessed, and I knew he was rushing toward a goal he had not fully secured. Now the real work began. I was going to tear his operation apart, piece by piece, until he had nowhere left to hide. The tires of my truck crunched over the packed snow as I navigated the winding county road toward town. The heater finally managed to push out a weak, fragile stream of lukewarm air, but my core remained chilled. The blinding morning sun reflected off the frozen fields, casting harsh white glares across my windshield. I drove with both hands gripping the wheel tight enough to turn my knuckles white. I was running on zero sleep and wearing yesterday's funeral dress, but my mind operated with pristine clarity. I was heading straight to the local precinct. If a man breaks a lock and seizes a house, you call the law. That was the logical sequence of events. That was how civilized society functioned. The county sheriff office sat in a square brick building near the edge of the town square. I parked in the plowed visitor lot and walked through the heavy glass doors. The interior smelled of wet wool, stale coffee, and the sharp chemical tang of pine floor cleaner. A lone dispatcher sat behind thick, bulletproof glass, typing lazily on a keyboard. When I asked for Sheriff Wyatt Jensen, she pointed toward a closed wooden door down the narrow hallway. Wyatt Jensen had worn the Silver Star for over a decade. He was a man who built his career on firm handshakes, giving speeches at the annual agricultural fair, and breaking up minor bar scuffles before they escalated. He knew my husband. He had sat at our dinner table eating roasted chicken and talking about crop yields. I expected outrage from him. I expected him to grab his coat, call for a deputy, and drive back out to the farm to drag Travis off my porch in handcuffs. Instead, when Jensen ushered me into his cramped office and listened to my report, his demeanor shifted. He settled behind his cluttered metal desk, resting his elbows on the surface and folding his hands together. He did not look at my face. He focused his gaze on a stack of manila folders resting near his coffee mug. "Melody," he began, his tone dripping with a heavy, synthetic sympathy. "I am truly sorry about Calvin. He was a pillar of this community. But what you are describing to me right now is a family dispute." I leaned forward, pressing my cold hands flat against the edge of his desk. "A family dispute," I repeated, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Wyatt, he drilled out the deadbolt while I was watching my husband go into the ground. He stole my winter survival gear and left me in the driveway in -10-degree weather. That is not a dispute. That is criminal endangerment and trespassing. Jensen sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. His uniform shirt pulled tight across his chest as he shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. Travis called the station an hour ago. He said you might come down here causing a scene. He emailed my deputies a photograph of a will. He claims Calvin left the estate to him and that you are refusing to vacate the premises. He showed you a picture of a piece of paper on a phone. I countered, my pulse steadying into a slow, rhythmic drumbeat against my temples. I am the legal resident. My clothing is in those closets. My medication is on that kitchen counter. You know me, Wyatt. I know you, Melody. But the law does not operate on who I know. As long as he is inside the house claiming residency and claiming inheritance, I cannot send men with guns to kick down the door. It is a civil matter. The phrase hit the air like a lead weight. A civil matter. It was the ultimate shield for law enforcement when they wanted to avoid complex paperwork or difficult confrontations. Jensen was not acting out of malice. He was acting out of cowardice, masquerading as diplomacy. He did not want to step into the middle of a wealthy agricultural family messy probate war. He preferred to let the lawyers fight it out while he kept his hands clean. You need to go to the courthouse, Melody. You need to file a formal eviction or get a judge to issue an emergency injunction. Until a judge hands me a signed piece of paper telling me to remove him, my hands are tied. As Jensen continued to mumble excuses about jurisdictional limits and probate courts, his voice faded into a dull background hum. I stopped looking at his face and stared blankly at the badge pinned to his chest. It was just a piece of shaped metal. It offered no real protection. While the sheriff rambled a specific visual memory from yesterday, funeral surged to the forefront of my mind. It was a detail I had registered but failed to process in the fog of my grief. We had been standing under the green canvas canopy by the open grave. The wind chill was pushing 15 below zero. Everyone around us was shivering, burying their faces deep into heavy wool scarves and thick collars. But Travis was not shivering. He was standing a few feet away from the casket, shifting his weight from left to right. I remembered looking at his forehead. A distinct sheen of sweat caught the pale winter light. A man does not perspire in sub-zero temperatures unless his internal temperature is spiking from pure, unadulterated panic. He kept stepping away from the mourning family, turning his back to the pastor. I recalled him reaching inside his expensive tailored suit jacket. He did not pull out his sleek silver smartphone. He pulled out a thick, cheap plastic prepaid burner phone. He stared at the screen, his thumbs moving frantically over the digital keypad. Then he snapped it shut and looked over his shoulder. He did not look toward his father's casket. He looked toward the wrought iron gates of the cemetery, scanning the parked cars like he expected uninvited guests to arrive at any second. The pieces snapped together in my mind with terrifying precision. The burner phone, the sweat in the freezing cold, the frantic glances toward the gate, the heavy flatbed truck tracks leading to the equipment barn, the desperate rushed lockout on the very day of the funeral. Travis was not grieving. Travis was not merely a spoiled son claiming an early inheritance out of spite. He was on a ticking clock. He owed somebody. He owed somebody dangerous enough to make him sweat in the freezing cold and desperate enough to make him risk killing his stepmother by locking her out in a blizzard. He needed assets, and he needed them yesterday. He was attempting to liquidate Calvin's estate before anyone could stop him. "Wyatt," I said, interrupting the sheriff mid-sentence. Jensen blinked, leaning back in his chair. "Yes, Melody." "I am not going to cause a scene," I told him, standing up from the wooden chair. My voice was stripped of all emotion, echoing the detached clinical tone I used when finding $1 million deficit in a corporate ledger. I am not going to argue with you. Thank you for your time. I turned and walked out of his office before he could offer another empty apology. I pushed through the heavy glass doors and stepped back out into the bitter North Dakota morning. The cold air hit my face, but I barely felt the sting. The vulnerability that had plagued me during the long, dark night in the truck evaporated. I was no longer a grieving widow seeking rescue from a man with a badge. No one was coming to save me. I had to save myself. I shifted my entire mindset, adopting the precise, ruthless posture of an auditor preparing for a hostile corporate takeover. In a corporate raid, when a predator seizes the physical headquarters, they immediately pivot to the next most vulnerable target. They go after the liquid capital. If Travis was desperate enough to lock me out and attempt to fence heavy farm machinery, he was not going to stop at the front door. He needed cash to satisfy whatever shadow was chasing him. Calvin and I shared joint checking and savings accounts at the local credit union, holding the operational funds for the entire spring planting season. I pulled my truck door open and climbed into the driver's seat. I slammed the door shut and jammed the key into the ignition. Travis had a head start on the house, but he could not access the bank without passing through security protocols. I threw the truck into drive and pressed my foot hard against the accelerator, the tires spinning slightly on the ice, before gripping the road. I had to beat him to the vault. The drive from the precinct to the Dakota Prairie Farmers Credit Union took less than 8 minutes, but my mind mapped out an entire financial battlefield during that short span. I parked my truck diagonally across a salted space near the side entrance, ignoring the designated lines hidden beneath the sleet. The credit union occupied a sturdy brick building on the corner of Main Street, serving as the economic bedrock for every farming operation within a 50-mile radius. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors, stepping into the heated lobby. The scent of damp wool and cheap commercial carpet cleaner filled the air. Before I could even brush the melting snow from my shoulders, Nora Higgins intercepted me. Nora had managed this branch since the late 90s. She was a woman of rigid protocols and sharp instincts, wearing her signature silver-framed glasses perched low on her nose. She did not offer a polite greeting or extend condolences. She grasped my elbow, her fingers digging past the fabric of my dress, and pulled me swiftly toward the frosted glass walls of her private office. "Sit down, Melody," she instructed, securing the door latch behind us. The blinds were already drawn tight, blocking the view from the teller line. Nora walked behind her desk and sank into her chair. Her face looked paler than usual, the fluorescent overhead lights casting harsh shadows under her eyes. Travis was standing on the front welcome mat when I unlocked the doors at 8 o'clock this morning. My pulse drummed a steady, measured rhythm against my temples. I sat straight in the guest chair, folding my hands in my lap. "Tell me exactly what he attempted to do," I said, keeping my voice stripped of any panic. Nora pulled a printed ledger sheet from a secure folder. He looked entirely frantic. He leaned over my desk and spun a highly convincing narrative. He claimed Calvin passing triggered a severe mental break in you. He used the phrase rapid onset dementia. He said you wandered out into the storm last night, confused and hostile, and that he had to secure the estate assets immediately to pay for your specialized medical care facility. The sheer precision of the lie commanded a dark, twisted sort of respect. Travis knew he could not simply walk in and declare himself the sole owner without raising red flags. Instead, he weaponized my grief and painted himself as the burdened, responsible son, stepping up to manage a tragic medical crisis. He intended to drain the primary joint savings, capturing the capital required to sustain the farm through the upcoming season. He demanded an immediate wire transfer to a private external routing number. Nora continued tapping her pen against the ledger. "But Travis lacks your fundamental understanding of agricultural banking. He did not realize that 5 years ago, you and Calvin updated the primary operational holdings to require dual physical signatures for any withdrawal exceeding $5,000. I told him his power of attorney paperwork from Calvin meant nothing without your authorizing signature. I denied the wire transfer. A brief wave of relief washed through my exhausted muscles, but Nora's expression remained grim. She slid the printed paper across the desk. I blocked the primary accounts, Nora said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. But Calvin maintained an old secondary equipment maintenance fund. It was established before your marriage and remained a single signature account. Travis possessed Calvin's death certificate and the executor draft. Legally, I had no grounds to deny his access to that specific ledger. He emptied it, Melody. He took $40,000 in a cashier check and walked out. I stared at the zeros printed on the right column of the statement. $40,000 vanished into the winter air. Most widows would break down weeping over the staggering theft. My analytical mind simply cataloged the data point. The theft confirmed my theory regarding the burner phone and the frantic sweating at the cemetery. Travis was bleeding cash to an unseen predator. He did not want that money to invest or save. He needed liquid capital right this second to temporarily satisfy a looming threat. Freeze everything I commanded, sliding the paper back to her. Flag the joint debit cards, the agricultural credit lines, and the emergency overdraft reserves. Put a hard lock on the entire portfolio. If he tries to buy a pack of gum using a farm account, I want the card declined. Done. Nora nodded, her fingers flying across her keyboard with practiced efficiency. Next, I need access to the vault, I said, standing up. Nora led me down the narrow corridor toward the heavy steel reinforced door of the safety deposit room. The metallic clank of the locking mechanism echoing in the sterile hallway sounded like a prison gate sealing shut. We matched our keys, turning them simultaneously to extract a long rectangular metal box from the polished steel grid. I carried it to a private viewing booth, closing the privacy curtain behind me. Inside the box, nestled beneath an old stack of Calvin life insurance policies, lay a thick manila envelope. I opened the flap and withdrew the original property deed. The thick parchment felt crisp and heavy in my hands. The county seal was pressed firmly into the bottom right corner. I traced my finger over the typewritten ink. The 1998 conveyance documented my uncle granting the acreage exclusively to me. Calvin's name was added much later, categorized strictly as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. The paper proved Travis had just committed a felony, breaking and entering offense. I slipped the document into my leather tote bag. The truth was now securely in my possession. Before leaving the credit union, I needed to manufacture a tactical diversion. Travis was arrogant, but he was not stupid. He held the digital login credentials for the shared operational checking account, having synced it to his smartphone months ago. He would receive push notifications for every transaction. If I purchased a hot coffee at the local diner, he would know my exact geographical location. He would realize I was lingering in town preparing a counterattack. I had to feed his arrogance. I needed him bloated with false confidence, leaving his defenses wide open while I built a legal guillotine. I left the bank and drove toward the edge of town where the interstate highway intersected the rural roads. The local Greyhound bus depot operated out of a dilapidated gas station. The neon sign buzzed erratically in the gray morning light. I walked inside the convenience store, smelling stale hot dogs and diesel fuel. Stepping up to the ticketing counter, I pulled out the shared farm debit card. "One-way ticket to Bismarck, please," I told the clerk. I paid the $75 fare, inserting the chip into the reader. The transaction processed, the receipt printed. Somewhere across town, a digital alert illuminated a screen. I could visualize the scene with crystal clarity. Travis sitting in my kitchen, holding his phone, his thumbs swiping down to read the banking notification. Greyhound lines, Bismarck Terminal. He would let out a sharp bark of laughter, showing the screen to Natalie. He would brag that the old bat finally gave up and ran. He would assume the freezing night in the truck broke my resolve. He would believe I was currently sitting on a damp bus seat, fleeing westward in total defeat, abandoning the farm to his greedy hands. He would drop his guard entirely. I took the printed ticket from the cashier, walked directly to the metal trash can by the exit, and dropped the paper into the garbage. I climbed back into my pickup truck, but I did not steer toward the highway entrance ramp. Instead, I drove 3 miles in the opposite direction, heading toward the forgotten outskirts of the county line. The Starlight Inn was a cheap roadside motel with peeling white paint and a flickering vacancy sign. It was the kind of establishment that accepted cash, asked 0 questions, and catered primarily to transient seasonal rig workers. I paid for a room using the cash I kept folded in my glove compartment. Room number 7 smelled of harsh bleach and old cigarette smoke. The floral bedspread looked faded and rough. It was far from the sprawling comfort of my farmhouse, but it was secure. I set my leather tote bag onto the small laminated desk in the corner. I pulled out the pristine property deed, spreading it flat under the glow of a cheap brass desk lamp. This motel room was no longer just a place to sleep. It was a war room. I opened my laptop, connecting to the unsecured wireless network. Travis thought the game was over. He thought the board was cleared. He was utterly unaware that I was about to dig into the digital property records and unearth the real reason he needed that land so desperately. A $40,000 theft was merely a temporary bandage. The title search portal loaded on my screen, promising to reveal a multi-million-dollar secret buried deep beneath the frozen North Dakota soil. The Starlight Inn offered a meager shelter, but it provided the quiet isolation I required to execute the next phase of my operation. I sat at the cheap laminate desk, drinking bitter instant coffee from a foam cup and reviewing the mental catalog of my assets. The physical deed was safe inside my leather tote bag, but I needed the undeniable weight of the county record to forge my weapon. I packed my belongings into the truck and steered toward the county courthouse. The roads were slick with black ice, demanding slow, deliberate navigation. The courthouse stood in the center of the square, a towering structure carved from heavy gray limestone. It looked like a fortress built to withstand the punishing Midwestern elements. I walked up the salted concrete steps, pushing through the heavy revolving doors. The interior air smelled of ancient paper lemon polish and dry radiator heat. I bypassed the security desk and walked directly down the echoing marble hallway toward the Register of Deeds office. A solitary clerk named Martha sat behind a high wooden counter sorting through a stack of manila folders. Martha had worked in this building for 30 years. She knew the history of every acreage, every property line, and every family feud in the county. She looked up, adjusting her thick-rimmed glasses, and offered a tight, polite smile. Melody. "I was so sorry to hear about Calvin," she said, her voice soft and genuine. "Thank you, Martha," I replied, keeping my tone professional and detached. "I need to pull the current abstracts and any recent filings from my residential parcel." She nodded, turning to her computer terminal, her fingers tapping across the mechanical keyboard. As she navigated the digital database, I reflected on the sheer arrogance of Travis Wood. He presumed that because his father ran the daily farming operations, the land inherently belonged to his paternal bloodline. He was blinded by the outdated assumption that the man driving the tractor owned the dirt beneath the tires. He never bothered to investigate the origin of the estate. This 600-acre expanse never belonged to Calvin. It was my ancestral land. My grandfather broke the sod and my uncle expanded the borders. When my uncle passed away in the late 90s, he transferred the title exclusively to me. I managed the soil chemistry, I audited the yields, and I paid the property taxes. 15 years ago, when Calvin and I married, I went to this very courthouse and filed a specific legal modification. I added my husband to the deed, designating him as a joint tenant with right of survivorship. In agricultural law, that specific phrasing operates as an unyielding iron vault. It dictates that upon the death of one tenant, the entire property instantly and automatically vests solely in the surviving owner. The transfer bypasses probate court entirely. A last will and testament holds zero authority over a joint tenancy. Calvin could have written 100 wills, leaving the farm to Travis, and every single one of them would be legally worthless. The second Calvin drew his final breath, Travis became a trespasser. When he drilled out my locks and refused me entry, he did not just commit a civil offense. He committed felony breaking and entering on my private property. Martha frowned, peering closely at her glowing monitor. Her fingers paused over the keyboard. "Melody, there is something unusual logged on your parcel here," she murmured. "Turn the screen toward me, please," I requested. She swiveled the heavy monitor. I leaned against the wooden counter, scanning the digital ledger. Below the standard tax assessments and the routine agricultural boundary surveys, a new entry sat in the pending file. It was a formal title inquiry initiated 48 hours ago by a third-party land management firm. I recognized the corporate entity immediately. They represented one of the largest energy extraction conglomerates operating in the Bakken Shale Formation. My analytical mind dissected the data, piecing together the true motive behind the freezing lockout. The Bakken Formation was a lucrative underground ocean of crude oil spanning across the western half of the state. Energy corporations routinely approached landowners seeking surface use agreements to position their drilling rigs and establish access roads. The standard signing bonus for a parcel the size of my farm hovered around $1 million. Travis was not merely stealing a house to live in. He had engaged in secret negotiations with an energy conglomerate. The heavy flatbed truck tracks near my equipment barn suddenly made perfect sense. He was planning to sell off Calvin machinery to clear the necessary acreage for the oil company heavy equipment. To secure that $1 million bonus, the corporate landmen required proof of physical possession and unencumbered ownership. Travis locked me out on the day of the funeral to stage the property. He needed the house empty so he could sign the corporate lease portraying himself as the undisputed heir. Martha looked at me, her eyes wide with unspoken concern. "Should I print this inquiry for your records?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "And then I need you to hand me the standard forms for filing a notice of pending action." I did not reach for my cell phone to call the energy company. A frantic phone call from an angry widow would merely be routed to a low-level customer service representative and ignored. Corporate machines do not halt their operations for emotional complaints. They only stop for legal barricades. I needed to construct an impenetrable concrete wall across his path. I took the blank forms to a small wooden desk in the corner of the office. I retrieved a black pen from my bag and began to write. I was drafting a lis pendens. In the realm of real estate litigation, a lis pendens is the ultimate tactical strike. It is a formal public notice indicating that the title of a property is currently subject to a severe legal dispute. It acts as a radioactive tag on the deed. When the energy corporation prepared to release the $1 million wire transfer, their legal department would run one final mandatory compliance check on the property title. The moment their software detected my lis pendens, the entire transaction would trigger an automatic hard stop. No title insurance company on the planet would underwrite a commercial lease on a disputed parcel. The corporate attorneys would freeze the funds indefinitely. Travis would be left standing at the altar, waiting for a payday that was never going to arrive. I filled out the parcel identification numbers, the legal descriptions, and my sworn statement of sole ownership. I walked back to the counter and handed the completed documents to Martha, along with the required filing fee. "Stamp it and record it immediately," I instructed. Martha pressed her heavy ink stamp onto the bottom of the page. The loud, solid thud echoed in the quiet office, sounding like a judge dropping a gavel. The trap was officially set. Travis was currently running up debts and making promises based on a phantom fortune. Every hour he spent inside my house was an hour he unknowingly spent digging his own financial grave. I thanked Martha, gathered my certified copies, and walked back out into the biting winter air. The sun was higher now, casting long, sharp shadows across the salted concrete. I felt a deep, profound sense of control returning to my frozen limbs. I had secured my perimeter and severed his supply line. I climbed into the cab of my pickup truck, turning the key in the ignition. As the engine rumbled to life, my phone buzzed inside my leather bag. It was not a single notification. It was a rapid, continuous succession of alerts, vibrating intensely against the lining. I pulled the device out and unlocked the screen. The notifications were pouring in from various local community groups and rural neighborhood forums. I opened the primary application and saw a photograph of Calvin, standing next to Travis, smiling in the summer sun. Above the photograph was a lengthy paragraph written by Natalie. My eyes scanned the text, absorbing the sheer venom of her words. She was spinning a fabricated narrative, claiming I had emotionally abused Calvin in his final days and tried to steal cherished family heirlooms. She wrote that Travis was forced to change the locks to protect his father's legacy from a greedy stepmother. The rural community, the same people I had shared church pews and harvest dinners with for 15 years, were reacting in real time. The comments beneath her post were a rising tide of judgment and condemnation. They were turning against me. Travis could not access the money, so his wife had decided to strip me of my reputation instead. I sat in the idling pickup truck, watching the digital venom spread across my glowing screen. The rectangular display illuminated the dark interior, casting long shadows over the dashboard. Natalie had crafted a masterclass in digital fiction. She posted a long, sprawling narrative on the most popular community board in the county. The text was accompanied by a carefully filtered photograph of Calvin, looking frail during his final days, sitting in his favorite leather armchair. Natalie did not possess a single ounce of genuine Midwestern grit. She was raised in a polished Minneapolis suburb and treated our rural town like a rustic aesthetic for her social channels. She detested the smell of diesel and the dirt tracked into the mudroom, but she craved the social status of being attached to a prominent agricultural family. Now she was using that platform to rewrite history. Her post claimed I spent Calvin's last hours securing my own financial interests instead of holding his hand. She wrote a tearful paragraph detailing how Travis was forced to change the farmhouse locks to protect cherished family heirlooms from a stepmother who intended to pawn them. She specifically mentioned a silver pocket watch and a handcrafted quilt, items I had personally paid to have restored years ago. The comments section multiplied with astonishing speed. People I had known for 15 years, neighbors who had eaten my casserole at church potlucks, left remarks expressing their shock and disgust. They called me a gold digger. They praised Travis for protecting his father's legacy. I did not respond. Engaging in an emotional mudslinging contest was a fool errand. An auditor does not argue with the ledger. An auditor simply gathers the receipts. I engaged the screen capture function on my phone, saving every lie, every comment, and every digital timestamp. I was building an impenetrable archive of defamation. My stomach grumbled, a hollow physical reminder that I had not eaten a hot meal since the morning before the funeral. I shifted the truck into gear and steered toward the center of town. The Main Street Diner was a narrow, bustling establishment lined with cracked red vinyl booths and a long, chrome counter. It served as the unofficial town hall for the local farming community. I pushed through the heavy glass door. A small brass bell chimed, signaling my arrival. The air inside felt thick, redolent of fried onions, black coffee, and melted butter. The diner was packed with the lunch rush. A dull roar of overlapping conversations echoed off the tin ceiling. Then the noise stopped. It was not a gradual quiet. It was an abrupt, heavy silence that rippled outward from the entrance. Men in heavy denim jackets stopped chewing. Women sitting at the booths lowered their coffee mugs. Dozens of eyes darted toward me and then swiftly averted, fixing their gazes on their plates or the linoleum floor. I recognized the feed store owner who had sold me grain just last week. He suddenly found the salt shaker fascinating. I saw the choir director from my congregation whispering behind her hand to her husband. The digital poison had already infected the physical world. I kept my posture rigid, my chin parallel to the floor, and walked to an empty stool at the far end of the counter. A waitress named Clara stood near the pie display, holding a glass carafe of coffee. I had personally driven Clara to her medical appointments 3 winters ago when her own car broke down. She walked over, her shoulders tight, and filled my ceramic mug without meeting my eyes. She did not offer her usual warm greeting. She simply slid a laminated menu across the surface and walked away. The ostracization stung a sharp, cold prickle against my skin, but I refused to let my hands shake. I ordered a bowl of chili and ate it methodically, focusing solely on the warmth spreading through my chilled core. I paid my bill in exact change, left a generous tip on the counter, and walked back out into the biting winter afternoon. The gravel parking lot lay bathed in the harsh white glare of the midday sun. The air was crisp and painfully thin. As I reached into my pocket for my keys, the loud roar of a high-performance engine shattered the quiet. A dark luxury SUV swerved off the main road, kicking up a spray of dirty slush and rock. The vehicle jerked to a halt, blocking my pickup truck into its parking space. The driver's side door flew open, and Travis stepped out. He wore a light designer jacket wholly inappropriate for the freezing temperature. His face was flushed a dark, mottled red. His eyes darted wildly, zeroing in on me standing by the driver's side door of my truck. He had checked the bus terminal. He had checked the transit logs. He realized the Bismarck ticket was a decoy. The realization that I was still in town operating outside his control had cracked his polished facade wide open.
"Where do you think you are going, Melody?"
he shouted, his voice echoing off the brick wall of the diner. He marched across the frozen gravel, his heavy boots crunching loudly. He invaded my personal space, stopping mere inches from my face. I could smell stale coffee and the sour metallic tang of adrenaline rolling off his skin.
"Give me those keys," he demanded, thrusting his open palm toward my chest.
That truck was purchased with farm funds. It belongs to the estate. It is my property now. Hand over the keys before I call Wyatt and have you arrested for grand theft. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at his trembling, outstretched hand, and then up at his furious, flushed face. Behind him, the diner windows were filled with faces. The patrons had abandoned their meals, pressing against the glass to watch the spectacle. A few pedestrians on the sidewalk stopped pulling their coats tighter, pausing to witness the heir of the Wood family lose his mind in a public parking lot. Natalie had spent the entire morning painting a digital portrait of a terrified, grieving son, protecting his home from a hostile intruder. Now the entire town was watching that same son scream at a silent 58-year-old widow, demanding her vehicle in the middle of the street. I reached into my peacoat pocket. Travis smirked, assuming I was retrieving the keys to surrender. Instead, I pulled out my smartphone. I swiped the screen open, tapped the camera application, and engaged the video recording function. I held the device up, framing his red, enraged face and his threatening posture. The little red dot blinked steadily.
Travis froze. The sight of the camera lens broke his momentum. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He looked around, suddenly hyper-aware of the audience pressing against the diner glass.
"Are you going to hit me, Travis?" I asked, my voice smooth, even, and carrying clearly in the crisp air. The microphone captured every syllable. "Are you going to physically assault me for a truck that is registered in my name?"
His jaw worked furiously. A vein pulsed thick and blue at his temple. He pointed a shaking finger at the lens.
"You are stealing from my family," he hissed, his voice dropping to a harsh, ragged whisper. "I am standing in a public space, recording a man who is threatening me," I replied, my tone identical to the one I used when verifying a bank routing number. "Do you have any other demands for the permanent record?" He stepped back, his breathing shallow and erratic. He realized the trap he had just walked into. If he touched me, he was going to jail. If he continued screaming, he destroyed the fragile narrative his wife had constructed online. He was paralyzed by his own lack of foresight.
I lowered the phone but kept the recording active. I sidestepped his rigid, trembling frame, unlocked my truck door, and climbed into the driver's seat. I started the engine, the familiar rumble vibrating through the floorboards. Travis stood frozen in the slush, staring at me with a mixture of pure hatred and dawning terror. I shifted into reverse. He had to stumble backward to avoid the heavy steel bumper. I navigated around his poorly parked luxury SUV, tires crunching over the frozen gravel, and pulled out onto the main thoroughfare. I glanced in the rearview mirror, watching him stand alone in the icy lot, surrounded by the silent, judging stares of the local community. The public tantrum had just handed me the final piece of character evidence I required. I drove back toward the Starlight Inn, my mind already pivoting to the next phase. As I steered down the quiet rural route, my phone pinged with a new banking alert. It was not a message from the local community board. It was an automated notification from my locked credit profile. Someone was attempting to open a high-limit corporate credit card using the farm tax identification numbers. Travis thought he was about to become an oil baron, and he was already spending the ghost money. The Starlight Inn room offered nothing but a thin, lumpy mattress and a humming iron radiator, but it served as the perfect command center for an auditor. I sat on the edge of the stiff bed, balancing my laptop on my knees. The notification that chimed during my drive back from the diner still blinked in the corner of my screen. Someone was applying for a high-tier commercial credit card using the farm tax identification number. Travis believed his financial ship had arrived. He assumed the corporate energy funds were merely navigating standard banking delays and would materialize in his account by Monday morning. He was spending phantom money. I navigated to the county clerk digital portal, entering the parcel identification digits for my land. I needed to confirm that my trap had snapped shut. The screen refreshed, displaying the updated ledger for my acreage. Below the standard agricultural zoning codes, my notice of pending action sat like a glowing red beacon on the public record. Just beneath it, a new document had been filed only an hour ago by the legal department of the Bakken Energy conglomerate. I clicked the link to view the public abstract. It was a formal notice of suspension regarding a surface use agreement. The corporate attorneys had run their mandatory final title search before authorizing the 7-figure signing bonus. Their advanced software detected my pending action notice instantly. Corporate entities operating in the oil sector do not take risks with contested real estate. A disputed title meant potential lawsuits, delays in drilling, and logistical nightmares. They halted the wire transfer indefinitely. Furthermore, the abstract included a strict compliance note flagging the applicant, Travis Wood, for fraudulent misrepresentation of ownership. In the span of a single afternoon,
Travis had permanently blacklisted himself across the entire Midwestern oil extraction network. He would never see a single dime of that energy money. A harsh bark of laughter escaped my lips, echoing off the cheap wood paneling of the motel room. The irony was poetic and staggering. Travis was currently operating under the delusion of impending extreme wealth. I opened a separate browser tab and navigated to Natalie's public social media profiles. She had spent the entire morning painting me as a cruel villain to the local community, but now her narrative had shifted to blatant celebration. Her feed was a real-time broadcast of their financial suicide. The most recent photograph showed her sitting at an upscale steakhouse in Bismarck, 50 miles away. 2 crystal flutes of expensive champagne sat on a crisp white tablecloth. The caption read, "Celebrating the next chapter of the Wood family legacy, blessing upon blessing." The next image featured the trunk of Travis' luxury sport utility vehicle. It was overflowing with glossy shopping bags from high-end designer boutiques. I recognized the logos from stores that did not exist in our quiet, rural county. They had driven to the city to celebrate. Another post detailed her ordering custom leather interior upgrades for a brand new horse trailer, dropping a massive deposit to secure the fabrication. Every swipe of their plastic, every signature on a high-interest financing agreement pushed them deeper into a gaping financial abyss. They thought they were oil barons. They thought they had secured a dynasty. The truth was that Travis had stolen $40,000 from an equipment fund and was now leveraging his personal credit to the breaking point. When the credit card bills arrived next month, there would be 0 corporate funds to cover the astronomical balances. They were celebrating their own funeral, and they were broadcasting the evidence to the entire world. I closed the web browser and turned my attention back to the physical world. I needed to transform this digital data into a tangible weapon. I packed my laptop and drove to a small independent printing shop situated on the edge of town. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, carrying a newly purchased, heavy-duty black binder and a box of plastic index tabs. I rented a private computer terminal in the back corner of the store and connected my secure flash drive. The commercial laser printer hummed and clicked, churning out page after page of undeniable truth. I worked with the quiet, steady rhythm of an auditor assembling a final destructive report. Tab 1 contained the pristine county-certified copy of the 1998 property deed, proving my sole survivorship and ownership. Tab 2 held the stamped documents from the credit union, detailing the exact timestamp and amount of the $40,000 theft Travis executed under false pretenses. Tab 3 secured the printed public abstract from the Energy Corporation, detailing the canceled lease and the formal fraud flag placed on his name. For Tab 4, I printed out every single social media post Natalie had uploaded since the funeral. I included the timestamps, the photographs of the luxury purchases, and the vicious, defamatory paragraphs she had written to assassinate my character. I highlighted the glaring contradictions with a yellow marker. She claimed they were terrified and grieving, while simultaneously posting pictures of champagne toasts and designer shopping bags. The hypocrisy was bound in ink. I snapped the heavy metal rings of the binder shut. The sharp metallic sound resonated with finality. This was no longer a disorganized collection of grievances. It was an empirical timeline of theft, defamation, and corporate fraud. It carried the physical weight of justice. I slid the binder into my leather tote bag, feeling the satisfying heft of it against my side. I returned to the Starlight Inn as the winter sun began its early descent, plunging the snow-covered landscape back into freezing twilight. I sat at the small desk, feeling a profound sense of readiness. I had gathered my armor and sharpened my blade. I was prepared to walk into a lawyer office on Monday morning and initiate a legal strike that would shatter Travis' illusion of control. I reached for my lukewarm coffee, planning to review the sequence of events one final time. I needed to ensure there were no gaps in my documentation. My phone rested silently on the desk, displaying the current time and a rotating carousel of mundane weather alerts. Then the screen brightened. A distinct chime pierced the quiet room. It was not a social media alert. It was not a banking notification. It was an automated message from the county probate court electronic tracking system. I had registered my name and Calvin estate details years ago to receive digital dockets regarding our agricultural tax assessments. I picked up the device, my thumb hovering over the glass. I opened the secure portal and read the fresh docket entry. Estate of Calvin James Wood. Filing party, Travis Wood. Document type, last will and testament. Status, pending judicial review. My breath caught in my throat. Travis must have checked his banking portals while sitting at that steakhouse. He had finally noticed that the energy wire transfer was stalled. Panic must have set in, shattering his champagne celebration. He realized that the unverified executor draft he had flashed at the sheriff was insufficient to force the corporate lease through. He needed ironclad, unassailable authority over the estate to appease the corporate lawyers and bypass the hold on the title. So he made a fatal, desperate maneuver. He formally submitted the fabricated will to a judge. The blurry photograph he had texted me while I was freezing in my truck was no longer just a cruel intimidation tactic. By submitting that fraudulent document to the county probate court with a forged signature, he had crossed the boundary from a civil squatter to a federal felon. I stared at the glowing screen, my heart hammering a new fierce rhythm against my ribs. He thought the fake will would save his oil deal. He had no idea he had just handed me the rope to hang him. The motel room faded into the peripheral background as the glowing laptop screen held my entire focus. I navigated to the county court secure portal and paid the $14 fee to download the scanned public filing. A portable document format file appeared in my designated download folder. I opened it and zoomed in on the digitized pages. The header read, Last Will and Testament of Calvin James Wood. The text consisted of boilerplate legal jargon likely purchased from a cheap internet template site. It claimed to supersede all previous testaments, granting the totality of the estate physical property, mineral rights, and farm implements solely to Travis Wood. I bypassed the standard clauses and scrolled directly to the final page, where the execution signatures rested. Calvin name sat on the bold black ink line. I stared at the strokes tracing the digital path with my index finger. A cold, calculating energy hummed in my veins. My husband was a left-handed man who spent 40 years gripping steering wheels and heavy wrenches. His natural penmanship always carried a distinct, harsh leftward slant. The ink was typically pressed deep into the paper, leaving an indentation you could feel blindfolded. The signature staring back at me from the screen was entirely wrong. It was smooth, upright, and written with a light, hesitant hand. It featured curved loops on the vowels that Calvin never used. It looked like someone attempting to draw a picture of a signature rather than writing their own name. But the visual discrepancy was merely the initial flaw. As an auditor, I never relied solely on visual anomalies. I relied on precise timelines. I checked the date written beside the signature. October 12th, a Tuesday, 3 weeks prior to his passing. I opened a new folder on my desktop where I kept digital copies of Calvin's medical records. I cross-referenced the dates. On Tuesday, October 12th, Calvin was admitted to the intensive care unit at the Regional Medical Center. His liver was failing. He was suffering from severe hepatic encephalopathy. The toxins building in his bloodstream ravaged his central nervous system, causing fierce, uncontrollable hand tremors. The doctors called the condition asterixis.
He could not lift a foam cup of water to his own mouth without spilling it down his hospital gown. The nurses had to feed him crushed ice from a plastic spoon. The medical charts from that specific Tuesday noted he was experiencing severe cognitive dissonance, unable to recognize his own brother who had come to visit. The notion that he sat up, grasped a pen, comprehended a complex legal document, and executed a flawless signature was a medical and physical impossibility. Travis had perjured himself by filing a forged legal document. But he needed a co-conspirator. A will required an official notary seal to be accepted by the probate clerk. I looked at the bottom right corner of the scanned page. A circular embossed stamp rested next to a messy cursive signature. State of North Dakota Notary Public. The printed name read, Veronica Blake. I recognized that name. I had seen it floating around the edges of Natalie's social media network. Veronica was Natalie's maternal cousin, a woman who lived in a sprawling subdivision near Fargo and drove luxury cars she could seemingly never afford on a standard administrative salary. Notarizing a forged document for a family member constituted a severe felony. It indicated a level of desperation that extended beyond simple greed. Why would a cousin risk her own freedom and her state license to help Travis steal a farm? I opened a new browser tab and began running searches on Veronica Blake. I bypassed the standard social media profiles and dug into the state regulatory filings and corporate registry databases. The search required patience. It took me 45 minutes of cross-referencing shell companies and limited liability corporations to find the hidden thread. Veronica Blake was not merely a rogue public notary. She was listed as the primary registered agent for a financial holding group operating out of a strip mall in Fargo. I pulled the public tax records for the holding group. The parent company was registered offshore in a jurisdiction known for shielding illicit financial activities. I leaned back in the creaking motel chair, my mind rapidly connecting the disparate data points. I had spent years analyzing the dark economy of rural agriculture, where desperate farmers sometimes turned to shadow lenders to cover bad harvest yields. I recognized the architecture of the holding group. It was a front for an illicit sports betting syndicate. They operated a high-stakes gambling ring disguised as a commercial lending firm. Veronica acted as their regional loan officer, securing collateral from individuals who found themselves drowning in underworld debt. The entire narrative snapped into sharp focus. Travis was not merely an entitled heir trying to secure an early inheritance to buy designer clothes. Those shopping bags and champagne flutes from the steakhouse were a fragile facade, a thin mask worn to convince his wife and the public that he retained control over his destiny. Underneath the tailored suits and the forced smiles, Travis was a cornered animal. He had engaged in high-stakes sports betting, trying to multiply his modest income and play the role of a wealthy oil tycoon. He lost big. He was in the hole for a staggering amount of money. The shadow lenders were closing in. They did not care about his excuses. They demanded payment or collateral. When Calvin passed away, the syndicate saw an opportunity. Veronica orchestrated the forgery, forcing Travis to submit the fake will. The syndicate commanded him to seize the property, lock me out, and liquidate the heavy machinery to settle the debt. They orchestrated the Bakken oil lease negotiations, attempting to capture the $1 million signing bonus to wipe his ledger clean. He forged a federal document because the alternative was facing men who broke bones and collected debts in dark alleys. He traded a civil dispute for a criminal conspiracy. The flatbed truck tracks near my equipment barn were not just a greedy son trying to sell a tractor. They were the physical footprints of a mob repossession effort. I sat in the dim motel room listening to the wind rattle the cheap glass window pane. The stakes had elevated far beyond a simple property disagreement.
I was no longer fighting a spoiled stepson. I was dismantling a desperate pawn controlled by a dangerous financial syndicate. They thought they could bulldoze a quiet rural widow. They assumed that would fold under the pressure of a winter lockout and a public smear campaign. They failed to realize they had picked a fight with a woman who understood the architecture of fraud better than they did. I saved the forged will, the medical timeline, and the corporate registry files into my encrypted digital vault. I connected my laptop to the commercial printer sitting in the motel business center down the hall. I printed the fresh evidence, adding a new section to my heavy black binder. The plastic rings snapped shut with a sharp, metallic crack. The documentation was complete. I possessed the sword, but I needed the right soldier to wield it in the courtroom. I could not walk into the courthouse alone and present the evidence to a judge without proper procedural execution. The legal system required a specific language. It required a translator who knew how to turn data into devastation. I needed a legal predator. I needed an attorney who specialized in tearing apart fraudulent claims and possessed the ruthless disposition required to destroy a syndicate pawn on the public record. The morning sun would rise soon, bringing Monday with it. I opened my search engine and began looking for the most feared civil litigator in the county. I typed the parameters into the search bar, looking for a man who did not settle out of court and did not negotiate with thieves. My operation was ready for the next phase, and I was going to ensure Travis faced a reckoning he could never outrun. Monday morning arrived with a pale gray light filtering through the thin motel curtains. I gathered my belongings and drove my pickup truck toward the commercial district of the county seat. The law offices of Crofton Associates occupied the top floor of a restored brick granary building, standing tall against the flat Midwestern skyline. I was not looking for a compassionate family attorney who wanted to facilitate a gentle mediation. I required a legal executioner. Gideon Croft held a reputation as the most ruthless civil litigator in a 300-mile radius. He was a man who dismantled fraudulent corporate mergers and shredded predatory lenders in open court. He did not possess a warm bedside manner. He operated with the precision of a surgeon severing infected limbs to save the host. I walked into his reception area, bypassing the plush leather couches, and handed my name to the paralegal. Within 3 minutes, I was sitting across from the man himself. Gideon Croft wore a sharp charcoal suit that contrasted with his weathered face and piercing gray eyes. He looked up from a stack of depositions, offering a brief, curt nod. He asked how he could assist a widow dealing with a standard inheritance dispute. I did not waste my breath on a tearful preamble or an emotional plea for sympathy. I reached into my leather tote bag and pulled out the heavy black binder. I placed it squarely in the center of his polished mahogany desk. The solid thud resonated through the quiet room. I told him this was not a dispute, but a coordinated criminal takeover of my agricultural estate. Gideon raised a skeptical brow, opening the plastic cover. I watched his eyes track across the first tab. He saw the certified original property deed proving my sole survivorship. He turned the page. He examined the credit union logs detailing the exact timestamp of the $40,000 theft. His initial skepticism began to evaporate, replaced by a sharp, focused intensity. He reached the Bakken Energy corporate abstract and the notice of pending action I had filed to freeze the $1 million lease. A low whistle escaped his lips, echoing in the silent office. By the time he reviewed the medical charts contrasting the forged will and analyzed the offshore corporate registry linking the notary to a shadow betting syndicate, Gideon leaned back in his leather chair. He removed his reading glasses, staring at me with genuine astonishment. He stated that he had reviewed investigations assembled by federal agencies that lacked the meticulous thoroughness of my binder. I replied that I spent 30 years finding missing money for a living,
and my stepson made the fatal error of assuming I was just a naive housewife. We moved immediately into tactical planning. Gideon suggested we could walk into the courthouse this afternoon, file an emergency injunction, and have the sheriff remove Travis by sunset. I shook my head, declining the rapid approach. Evicting him immediately would only solve the physical trespassing issue. It would allow him to play the victim to the community and possibly escape the federal fraud charges by claiming ignorance. I wanted his entire foundation shattered. I wanted the Shadow Syndicate to realize their pawn had failed. We needed to let Travis walk blindly into the spinning blades of his own arrogance. Gideon smiled a predatory grin that matched my exact frequency. He agreed that a simple warning letter would only cause the enemy to scatter and hide their tracks. Instead, we would draft the most airtight, unassailable notice to quit the premises ever constructed. We would prepare the civil suit for conversion of assets fraud and defamation, but we would hold the paperwork in a locked drawer. We would wait for Travis to make one final, desperate legal maneuver to hang himself on the public record. Cornered animals always make a mistake when the walls close in. We just needed to let him feel the crushing pressure of the stalled oil money and the looming syndicate debt. We finalized the documentation sealing the trap. I left the law office and stepped back out onto the street. The heavy glass doors shut behind me, and I immediately noticed a drastic shift in the atmosphere. The brutal sub-zero freeze that had gripped the region for the past week was breaking. A rare meteorological phenomenon known as a Chinook wind was rolling across the Great Plains. This warm, dry gust swept down from the western mountains, pushing the Arctic air masses away. The temperature was rising at an astonishing rate. I stood on the sidewalk, watching the thick, jagged icicles hanging from the street lamps begin to drip. The impenetrable sheets of black ice coating the asphalt cracked, turning into flowing slush. The harsh, unforgiving winter Travis had weaponized to try and kill my spirit was literally melting away. He thought he could freeze me out of my own legacy. He believed the cold would break my resolve and force me to abandon my land. But the ice was shattering. The physical thawing of the Badlands perfectly mirrored the impending collapse of his calculated fortress. His frozen barricades were turning to water, and soon he would have nothing left to stand on. I drove my truck through the slush-filled streets, feeling a profound sense of calm washing over my exhausted mind. The board was set. The pieces were locked in place. I only needed to wait for his next move. The silence from the farmhouse was unnerving. Travis was bleeding cash and running out of time. The offshore lenders would not tolerate delays, and the corporate lawyers were not going to lift the title freeze. He needed to clear me from the board entirely. He needed a weapon that would force me out of the county and silence me before I could challenge the forged will. I decided to drive toward the local cemetery. I wanted to stand by Calvin's grave and tell him that I was protecting the farm just as he had instructed me years ago. The graveyard was quiet, the snow softening under the warm Chinook breeze. I carried a bouquet of winter flowers, walking slowly toward the fresh mound of earth. As I knelt to place the stems against the temporary marker, I heard the crunch of footsteps approaching from behind. I turned my head expecting to see a groundskeeper. Instead, a man in a cheap, wrinkled suit stepped into my peripheral vision, holding a thick manila envelope. My heart rate accelerated. Travis was not waiting for the probate court to validate his fake documents. He was going on the offensive, attempting to weaponize the judicial system to destroy me before I even stepped foot inside a courtroom. The man in the wrinkled suit stopped 2 feet away from the fresh mound of earth. The Chinook breeze carried the rich scent of thawing mud and damp pine needles. He did not look down at the winter flowers I had just laid near the temporary grave marker. He stared directly at my face, verifying my identity against whatever physical description he carried in his head. Melody Wood?
he asked, his voice flat and transactional.
Yes, I replied, standing up slowly and brushing the dark soil from the knees of my slacks. He thrust a thick manila envelope toward my chest, forcing me to grab the paper before it fell into the slush. "You have been served," he stated. He offered no apologies and displayed no empathy for the setting. He simply turned on his heel and walked briskly toward a faded sedan parked along the cemetery access road. I stood alone among the granite headstones holding the heavy packet. The melting snow dripped from the bare branches of a nearby oak tree, hitting the ground with soft, rhythmic thuds. Travis was not waiting for the slow machinery of the probate court to validate his forged documents. He was launching a preemptive strike. He needed me paralyzed. He needed me terrified. He needed me as far away from that farmhouse as possible while he scrambled to satisfy his shadow lenders. I walked back to my pickup truck, the wet snow soaking through the thin material of my shoes. I climbed into the cab, engaging the heater to chase away the residual chill. I broke the seal on the envelope and pulled out a stack of formal legal filings. The bold heading across the top page read, "Temporary Restraining Order and Injunction." The issuing authority was the County District Court. My eyes scanned the paragraphs, digesting the legal phrasing with practiced efficiency. Travis had submitted a sworn affidavit under penalty of perjury. He painted a terrifying portrait of a deranged, grieving widow. The affidavit claimed that I had returned to the property the previous night, brandishing a hunting rifle and shouting death threats at Natalie. He stated I was suffering from a severe psychotic break triggered by the funeral, and that they feared for their immediate physical safety. The presiding magistrate had granted the temporary order based on the perceived imminent threat. The terms were explicit and severe. I was legally barred from coming within 500 feet of my own farmhouse. I was prohibited from contacting Travis or his wife through any medium. I was ordered to surrender any firearms in my possession to the local precinct. If I violated any of these conditions, law enforcement possessed the authority to arrest me on sight. Travis intended to use this document as a crushing psychological blow. He aimed to maximize the emotional cruelty by sending the process server to ambush me at my husband's resting place. He believed a 58-year-old woman would crumble upon receiving a court order threatening her with jail time. He thought I would pack my bags, board a bus, and flee the state, leaving him to plunder the estate in peace. Instead of dissolving into tears, I placed the document on the passenger seat and shifted the truck into drive. A profound, satisfying calm settled over my chest. Travis lacked a fundamental understanding of civil procedure. He viewed the restraining order as a permanent locked door. He failed to comprehend the judicial mechanics he had just set into motion. I drove straight back to the commercial district, steering toward the granary building where Gideon Croft operated. The streets were messy with melting ice, the tires kicking up dirty water against the wheel wells. I rode the elevator to the top floor and bypassed the receptionist, walking directly toward Gideon's corner office. His heavy oak door was partially open. I pushed it wide and stepped inside. Gideon sat at his mahogany desk, reviewing a thick stack of depositions. He looked up, surprised by the unannounced intrusion. I picked up the court order from my bag and tossed it onto the polished wood surface. It landed with a soft, sliding sound, stopping right over his leather blotter. "Read that," I instructed, sitting down in one of the leather guest chairs. Gideon picked up the stapled pages. His sharp gray eyes tracked rapidly across the text. He read the fabricated claims regarding the hunting rifle and the psychotic break. He scrutinized the magistrate's signature and the strict boundary restrictions. Most attorneys would express concern over a client facing criminal allegations. Gideon simply lowered the document, folded his hands, and smiled. It was a predatory, highly calculated grin. "Your stepson just made a catastrophic tactical error. Gideon said, leaning forward, resting his forearms on the desk. I know, I replied, matching his expression. He thinks he built a wall. He does not realize he just built a highway. Gideon tapped his index finger against the embossed court seal. Probate court is a sluggish, bureaucratic nightmare. If we relied solely on the civil suit we drafted this morning to evict him, it could take months to secure a hearing date. The courts are perpetually backed up with property disputes and routine inheritance claims. Travis could have stalled us with endless continuances while he quietly liquidated the farm machinery to pay off his gambling debts. But this Gideon held up the restraining order changes the timeline entirely. A temporary restraining order restricting access to a primary residence cannot be issued indefinitely without granting the accused a chance to defend themselves. The law requires a mandatory fast-tracked evidentiary hearing to determine if the order should become permanent. The judge scheduled the hearing for Thursday morning, Gideon noted, reading the final page. That is 72 hours from now. Travis bypassed the entire probate backlog. He just handed us a front-of-the-line pass to stand before a district judge and present our evidence. I leaned back in the chair, feeling the disparate pieces of my strategy locking into their final positions. Travis filed a sworn affidavit filled with blatant, undeniable lies. When we walk into that courtroom on Thursday, he will be sitting at the plaintiff table under oath. He expects me to show up crying, begging the judge to let me go home. He assumes we will be arguing about whether or not I own a hunting rifle. He has no idea we are bringing the binder, Gideon stated, his tone thick with anticipation. We are not just going to defend you against the restraining order. We are going to use his own hearing to introduce the certified property deed proving you own the land. We are going to introduce the hospital records proving the will he filed is a physical impossibility. We will submit the corporate energy abstract showing he attempted to commit wire fraud across state lines. Once Judge Caldwell sees the physical proof of his perjury, the restraining order will evaporate, Gideon explained. And because he submitted fraudulent documents to a district court, the judge will be compelled to refer the matter directly to the prosecuting attorney. Travis is walking into a civil hearing, but he will be leaving in criminal custody. The elegance of the trap was breathtaking. Travis thought he was burying me under legal paperwork. In reality, he had handed me the exact venue I needed to destroy him on the public record. There would be no quiet settlements. There would be no private mediations behind closed doors. The dismantling of his life would occur in open court, documented by a stenographer and presided over by a judge who despised perjury. We need to make sure every single piece of data is impenetrable, I told the lawyer. When we drop this bomb on Thursday, the shockwave needs to shatter his defenses instantly. He will try to claim ignorance. He will try to blame the forged will on bad legal advice from his cousin. We need to expose his underlying motive so the court understands the true depth of the criminal conspiracy. Gideon reached for his desk phone. My private investigator has been tracking the shadow syndicate operating out of Fargo. He is returning this afternoon with the final financial report. We know Travis owes them a substantial amount of money, but we need the exact ledger. We need to prove he leveraged a property he did not own to satisfy an illicit gambling debt. I nodded, standing up from the leather chair. Gather the investigator report. I will review the final binder tonight at the motel. Let him enjoy his false sense of security for the next 2 days. Let him sit in my house and believe he has outsmarted the system. I left the law office and returned to the Starlight Inn. The afternoon sun continued to warm the region, accelerating the spring thaw. The snowbanks outside my cheap window were shrinking, turning into muddy streams racing toward the highway drains. Travis was currently trapped in a rapidly deteriorating world. His oil lease was dead. His forged will was a ticking time bomb. His restraining order was a fatal miscalculation. But as I sat on the edge of the stiff mattress, waiting for Gideon investigator to deliver the final financial numbers,
I realized the most dangerous element of this equation was still unknown. A man cornered by the law is predictable. A man cornered by a ruthless betting syndicate is a volatile threat. Travis was running out of options, and a desperate man drowning in shadow debt might decide to sell the machinery out the back door tonight, before the gavel ever falls.
The walls of the Starlight Inn felt thinner as the evening crept over the thawing landscape.
I sat at the small laminated desk, nursing a lukewarm cup of bitter tea, while my laptop screen hummed in the dim light. The radiator hissed, pushing dry air into the cramped space. I was reviewing the digital copies of my evidence binder, checking every timestamp and signature. The trap for the Thursday court hearing was primed, but an unsettled feeling twisted in my stomach. The silence from the farmhouse felt too heavy. A cornered predator does not sit still. He thrashes. My cell phone vibrated across the faux wood surface. The caller identification displayed Gideon Croft Law Firm. I answered the call, bringing the receiver to my ear. "Melody, get back to my office," Gideon instructed, his voice stripped of standard professional pleasantries. "My investigator just walked through the door. He brought the final ledger. You need to see this right now."
I packed my laptop into my leather tote bag, threw on my pea coat, and hurried out to the truck. The evening air carried a strange, damp warmth, courtesy of the lingering Chinook wind. The once solid snowbanks were reducing to dirty puddles, reflecting the amber glow of the streetlights. I navigated the slush-covered roads with calculated urgency, pulling into the granary building parking lot 10 minutes later. I bypassed the empty reception desk and walked directly into the glass-walled conference room. Gideon sat at the head of the long, polished table. Next to him sat a lean, weathered man wearing a faded canvas jacket and wire-rimmed glasses. He looked less like a private detective and more like a weary accountant who spent his life digging through other people's trash. A thick manila folder rested on the glass surface between them. "Melody, this is Vance Gideon," said, gesturing to the man. "He has been tracking the financial footprint of the Fargo syndicate for the past 3 days." Vance did not offer a handshake. He simply slid the heavy folder across the smooth glass. It stopped inches from my hands. I flipped the cardboard cover open. The top document was a printed spreadsheet chronicling a series of offshore wire transfers, encrypted cryptocurrency exchanges, and intercepted text message logs. "Your stepson likes to play the high-stakes tables," Vance explained, his voice raspy and low. "He got hooked on international sports betting about 2 years ago. Started small, a few thousand here and there. Then he tried to leverage his wagers to cover his early losses. The hole got deeper. The people running the Fargo book are not the kind who send polite collection letters. They use a shell company called Apex Financial to launder their operations." I traced my finger down the debit column, tracking the escalating numbers. The mathematics of addiction laid bare on a single sheet of paper. "What is the final deficit?" I asked, keeping my gaze locked on the ledger. $300,000, Vance stated. "He owes them $300,000, and the principal is compounding weekly. They gave him a hard deadline, last Friday, the day of your husband's funeral." The sheer scale of the debt resonated in the quiet conference room. $300,000. Travis was not acting out of a misguided sense of entitlement. He was acting out of pure, unfiltered terror. He had mortgaged his physical safety to an underworld syndicate, and he lacked the personal capital to settle the ledger. Vance reached into his jacket pocket and retrieved a small stack of glossy photographs. He tossed them onto the table, fanning them out like a deck of playing cards. I leaned forward, examining the images. They were surveillance shots taken from a distance using a long telephoto lens. The first photograph showed Travis standing in the parking lot of a local dive bar. His posture was hunched, his shoulders tight near his ears.
He was chewing his thumbnail down to the quick while pressing a cheap burner phone to his ear. He looked like a man standing on the edge of a steep cliff, feeling the ground crumble beneath his boots. "Look at the third photo," Vance instructed, tapping his index finger against a grainy image. I pulled the photograph closer. The shot featured the gravel driveway of my farm. The corrugated metal doors of the equipment barn were rolled wide open. Two unfamiliar men wearing heavy work boots and dark jackets stood near the rear tires of Calvin Primary John Deere Combine. A large commercial flatbed truck idled in the background. My breath caught in my throat. The memory from the morning after the lockout rushed back with crystal clarity. The heavy dual tire tracks cutting through the fresh snow, the unexplained impressions leading directly from the highway to the barn. I had suspected Travis was attempting to liquidate assets, but seeing the visual proof solidified the reality. "Those are black market equipment fences," Vance said, confirming my silent realization. "They operate out of a chop shop near the state line. They retool serial numbers on heavy agricultural machinery and ship the hardware overseas. Travis brought them onto the property while you were at the cemetery. He was having the combines appraised to satisfy the syndicate debt." The mechanical pieces of the conspiracy locked together. Travis orchestrated the lockout because the mob fences required unfettered access to the property. He needed me out of the house and away from the barn so the appraisers could evaluate their collateral. He forged the will to present a facade of legal ownership. He applied for the Bakken oil lease, hoping the $1 million signing bonus would arrive in time to pay off the syndicate before they hauled the tractors away. "But the oil money is frozen," I murmured, staring at the photograph of my husband-prized combine. "I filed the notice of pending action. The corporate attorneys halted the wire transfer." Gideon nodded, his expression grim. "And Travis knows the money is stalled. That is why he filed the restraining order today. He is desperate. He thinks keeping you away from the farm will buy him enough time to figure out a backup plan." A sudden jarring realization struck me. I thought of the social media posts I had archived just a few hours ago. Natalie posting photographs of crystal champagne flutes. Natalie boasting about custom leather interiors for a new horse trailer. Natalie buying designer clothes on high-interest retail credit, celebrating her new status as a wealthy heiress. "She has no idea," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I looked up, meeting Gideon's eyes. Natalie does not know about the syndicate. She does not know about the $300,000 deficit. She genuinely believes they are inheriting a fortune. Vance let out a dry, cynical chuckle. "Wives rarely know until the collection agents show up at the front door. Travis is playing a lethal game of pretend. He is letting his wife max out their personal credit while he bargains with stolen tractors to keep the mob from breaking his kneecaps." The psychological portrait of my stepson shifted from a cruel bully to a dangerously unpredictable liability. Travis was trapped in a delusion of his own making. He was lying to his wife, lying to the courts, and lying to the men holding his debt. He was a cornered animal, suffocating under the weight of his own hubris. "We cannot wait for the Thursday court hearing," I stated, pushing the photographs back across the table. The tactical landscape had fundamentally changed. Gideon frowned, resting his hands on the glass surface. "The hearing is our best opportunity to destroy his credibility on the public record, Melody. If we go to a judge early, we lose the element of surprise. If we wait until Thursday, there will be nothing left to protect," I countered, standing up from my chair. The urgency pulsed through my veins. "The oil money is dead. The syndicate deadline has already passed. Travis is sitting in that farmhouse realizing his options have evaporated. A desperate man owing $300,000 to ruthless creditors will not sit patiently for a court date. He is going to call those equipment fences back tonight. He is going to load those combines onto the flatbed trucks and sell them for pennies on the dollar just to save his own skin." Vance adjusted his glasses, offering a subtle nod of agreement. "She is right, counselor.
The syndicate is not going to wait for probate court to clear the title. They are going to take their payment in cold steel. Once those tractors cross the state line, they vanish into the black market forever. "We have to force his hand," I declared, turning my attention fully to Gideon. "We drafted the eviction notice this morning. You said it was airtight. We need to serve it." Gideon stood up, retrieving a pristine white envelope from his leather briefcase. "It is unassailable. It includes the certified deed proving your sole ownership and demands immediate surrender of the premises within 24 hours. But serving this notice removes the element of stealth. Once he reads this paper, he will know you possess the true title." "He is going to find out anyway," I said, reaching out and taking the envelope from his hand. "I am not going to let a gambling addict sell my husband's legacy to a chop shop under the cover of darkness." The stakes had escalated from a strategic legal chess match into a real-time physical confrontation. It was no longer just about proving him wrong in a courtroom. It was about intercepting an impending criminal theft before the assets disappeared into the night. We needed to corner him on the property and force him to react. We needed to trap him inside his own lie and watch the walls cave in. The white envelope rested on the glass table, feeling heavier than its paper contents dictated. I handed it back to Gideon, refusing the urge to deliver the document myself. An amateur acts on emotion and confronts an adversary face to face, allowing pride to dictate the timeline. An auditor utilizes formal channels to ensure every action generates a legally binding receipt. We required an impartial witness to record the exact moment the delusion shattered and the trap closed. Gideon picked up his desk phone and dialed a private number. He requested a man named Miller, a retired state highway patrolman who now operated as a bonded process server. Miller specialized in high-risk deliveries. He knew how to hand over volatile paperwork without triggering a physical altercation. Gideon instructed him to drive out to the farmhouse, immediately serve the 24-hour notice to quit, and wait at the end of the county road to observe the resulting fallout. We sat in the glass-walled conference room while the evening stretched into the dark night. The Chinook wind continued to howl against the window panes, rattling the thick glass and pushing the scent of melting frost through the ventilation system. Vance packed up his surveillance photographs and quietly exited, leaving Gideon and me alone with the ticking wall clock. The coffee in my paper cup grew cold. I did not touch it. My focus remained entirely locked on the digital map in my mind, calculating the distance between the commercial district and my rural property line. At 8:45, the desk phone rang. Gideon pressed the speaker button, resting his hand near the receiver. "It is done," Miller reported, his voice carrying the static hum of a cellular connection. I handed the packet directly to the stepson. He opened it right there on the porch under the awning light. "What was his reaction?" Gideon asked, leaning closer to the speaker. "The color drained right out of his face," Miller answered. He read the certified deed and stopped breathing for a few seconds. Then he started shaking. Not the kind of shaking you get from the winter wind, the kind you get when a steel trap snaps shut on your leg. He crumpled the paper, threw it at my chest, and slammed the door. I am parked a half-mile down the highway right now. The lights inside the house are flashing on and off. He is tearing the place apart. "Stay on the line," Gideon instructed. We did not have to wait long for the visual confirmation. My cell phone illuminated resting flat on the polished table. A push notification from the local community network flashed across the glowing screen. Natalie had initiated a live video broadcast. I tapped the alert, opening the video feed. The digital picture buffered for a fraction of a second before resolving into a chaotic scene. Natalie filled the frame, holding her smartphone with a trembling hand. The camera shook wildly, capturing glimpses of the living room behind her. Her polished facade had crumbled entirely. Her carefully applied makeup ran in dark streaks down her cheeks.
She wore the expensive cashmere sweater from earlier, but the garment looked absurd amidst the sheer panic radiating from her wide eyes.
"They are trying to steal our home," she sobbed into the microphone, her voice shrill and frantic. "A corrupt legal system is trying to throw us out into the street. Melody hired some crooked lawyer and forged a fake deed. They sent a man to our door threatening us. We are not leaving. This is Travis' birthright. We are going to defend this family legacy."
Her hysteria was palpable, but the audio in the background of her video captured my immediate attention. Beneath her high-pitched crying, a deep, mechanical roar reverberated through the farmhouse walls. It was the unmistakable sound of a heavy diesel engine turning over. I watched the video feed intently. The camera angle shifted as Natalie paced near the front window. Through the glass pane, I saw a blinding flash of halogen headlights cutting through the darkness of the front yard.
"He is moving the machinery," I stated, keeping my eyes glued to the screen.
Out on the county highway, Miller's voice crackled through the speakerphone. "Counselor, you need to see this. The kid just drove a John Deere combine out of the barn. He is not heading for the access road. He is parking it horizontally across the main driveway." I knew that specific piece of hardware. It was a Series 9 harvester, towering over the landscape with immense, heavy steel treads and a sprawling front header designed to cut wheat. It weighed several tons. Travis was maneuvering the giant machine, placing it as a deliberate physical blockade to prevent any vehicles from entering or exiting the property limits. The live broadcast captured the grinding squeal of metal tracks scraping against the frozen gravel. Natalie spun the camera around, pointing the lens toward the front door. Travis stormed into the frame. He wore no winter coat, just a thin shirt soaked in nervous sweat. His eyes darted around the room with manic intensity.
"Keep recording,"
he yelled at his wife, snatching a heavy wooden dining chair and wedging it under the brass doorknob. "Let everyone see what they are doing to us. They want to play games? Nobody is taking this house. Nobody." Travis darted out of the frame, heading toward the rear of the property. Seconds later, the roar of a second engine echoed through the digital feed. "He just fired up the utility tractor," Miller reported over the phone, his tone shifting from casual observation to professional alarm. "He is driving it right up onto the lawn. He just parked the front loader bucket directly against the front porch steps. He is barricading the exits." I stared at the screen, feeling a profound, detached silence settle over my mind. I was witnessing the real-time collapse of a human being. The syndicate debt, the frozen oil lease, the forged paperwork, and the undeniable reality of the eviction notice had fractured his sanity. Cornered by the law and hunted by the Fargo mob, Travis snapped. He abandoned any pretense of legal maneuvering and resorted to raw, desperate survival tactics. He was using my husband's agricultural equipment, the very assets he desperately needed to sell to build a fortress out of desperation. Natalie continued weeping into the camera, pleading with her online audience to share the broadcast and expose the injustice. The comments scrolling up the side of the video feed transformed from expressions of support into widespread confusion and alarm. The rural community neighbors who had judged me harshly just hours prior were now watching the heir of the Wood family barricade himself inside a farmhouse like a fugitive. The narrative of the terrified, grieving son evaporated, leaving only the chaotic reality of a dangerous standoff. Gideon reached forward and tapped the mute button on his phone, severing the audio from the screaming video feed. He looked at me, his gray eyes sharp and calculating. "He just crossed the point of no return," Gideon noted calmly. "By restricting the driveway with heavy machinery and blocking the doors, he is no longer engaging in a civil property dispute. He is creating a public hazard and actively defying a court-mandated notice of eviction." I picked up my phone, terminating the live video application. The silence in the conference room felt heavy, charged with the electricity of an impending storm. "Call Sheriff Jensen," I instructed. my voice steady and cold. Gideon picked up the receiver and dialed the direct line to the local precinct. The phone rang twice before the dispatcher transferred the call. Wyatt Jensen answered, sounding tired and irritable. "Sheriff, this is Gideon Croft. I am sitting here with my client, Melody Wood." Counselor Jensen sighed. "I already told Melody this morning. I cannot intervene in a familial estate disagreement without a judge's signature. My hands are tied." "Your hands are untied," Gideon corrected his tone, slicing through the excuses like a scalpel. "You need to pull up the local community network feed right now. Travis Wood was served with a legal notice to quit the premises 20 minutes ago. In response, he has utilized industrial farming equipment to barricade the county access road and seal the entrances to the property. He is broadcasting a live disturbance holding his wife inside a fortified structure." The line went silent. I could hear the faint sound of typing as the sheriff pulled up the digital feed on his precinct computer. A heavy exhale filtered through the receiver. This is no longer a civil matter. Wyatt Gideon continued pressing his advantage. "You have a barricaded suspect creating a severe public safety hazard on a rural highway. If a fire breaks out in that house, emergency services cannot breach the perimeter. If you ignore this and someone gets hurt, the liability falls entirely on your badge." "I will assemble my deputies," Jensen replied, his voice stripped of all diplomacy. The cowardice was gone, replaced by the mandatory obligation of his office. "We are heading out there now." Gideon disconnected the call. He looked across the table, offering a slight nod of acknowledgement. The bureaucratic shield protecting Travis had just shattered. The local law enforcement agency, which had previously turned a blind eye to my freezing lockout, was now mobilizing tactical units to breach the farm. Travis thought he could hide behind a barricade of green steel. He believed he could command sympathy by crying victim on the internet. He failed to comprehend that an auditor does not argue with a man throwing a tantrum. An auditor simply documents the behavior, waits for the target to violate a binding regulation, and lets the authorities handle the collection. I stood up from the conference table, buttoning my peacoat. "Let us go, Gideon. I want to watch the metal bend." The drive back to the county limits took 20 minutes. I sat in the passenger seat of Gideon's heavy luxury sedan, watching the dark silhouette of the Badlands roll past the window. The Chinook wind buffeted the side of the car, rocking the chassis with sudden warm gusts. We did not speak. The silence shared between an attorney and his client right before the final gavel falls requires no filler. Ahead of us, the rural night sky flickered with rhythmic pulses of crimson and sapphire. The local precinct had mobilized. We approached the property line, slowing to a crawl. The scene unfolding at the end of my gravel driveway looked like a military checkpoint. 3 county sheriff cruisers sat parked at sharp angles, their high-beam spotlights piercing the darkness and illuminating the barricade. The towering John Deere Series 9 combine sat parked sideways, blocking the entire width of the entrance. Its green steel hull looked formidable under the harsh police lights. Gideon pulled his vehicle onto the soft shoulder of the highway, parking a safe distance away from the flashing strobes. I rolled down the window, letting the damp night air enter the cabin. The scent of melting frost mixed with the acrid stench of diesel exhaust. I could hear the low rumble of idling police engines and the static crackle of radio dispatch traffic. Sheriff Wyatt Jensen stood near the front bumper of his primary cruiser, holding a megaphone. His posture was rigid, his shoulders tense under his thick uniform jacket. Earlier that morning, he had dismissed my plight, hiding behind bureaucratic excuses to avoid confronting a prominent local family. His cowardice had allowed a desperate gambling addict to escalate a simple eviction into an armed standoff. The humiliation radiated from the sheriff every movement. He had lost control of his jurisdiction, and the flashing tactical lights broadcasted his failure to the entire county. Behind the combine, the farmhouse sat, bathed in the glow of the porch light. Travis paced back and forth across the wooden decking. He wore a thin dress shirt soaked in nervous perspiration. He had discarded his suit jacket hours ago. The ambient temperature lingered just above freezing, but the wind chill remained sharp. Travis ignored the cold. His movements were erratic, jerky, and fueled by pure adrenaline. In his right hand, he clutched a crumpled piece of paper, waving it frantically toward the line of deputies.
"That is my deed!"
Travis screamed, his voice hoarse and cracking, echoing across the empty fields.
"You have no jurisdiction here, Jensen. This is private property. My father left this land to me. You are trespassing."
The crumpled paper was the forged will. He was brandishing a fake document drafted by a shadow syndicate loan officer attempting to use it as a shield against a tactical police unit. The delusion was staggering. He had constructed a reality where shouting lies loud enough would magically transform them into truth.
Sheriff Jensen raised the megaphone to his mouth. "Travis Wood, you have been served with a lawful notice to vacate the premises. You are currently obstructing a public right-of-way and barricading an active residential zone. Drop the paper, step off the porch, and instruct your wife to exit the structure. If you do not comply, we will breach the perimeter."
Travis laughed. It was a high-pitched, jagged sound that lacked any real humor.
"You are not touching my house,"
he yelled, gripping the wooden porch railing.
"I know my rights. I know what the law says."
He knew nothing. He was a man drowning in a $300,000 debt, trying to command the ocean to stop rising. From my vantage point, I could see the front window of the living room. Natalie stood behind the glass, her face pale and illuminated by the glow of her smartphone screen. She was still recording, desperate to maintain her fabricated narrative of victimization, while her husband unraveled on the front steps. Jensen lowered the megaphone and offered a sharp nod to his deputies. The time for diplomacy had expired. Two officers wearing heavy tactical vests stepped forward. They were accompanied by a civilian contractor wearing a thick canvas coat and carrying a long pair of industrial bolt cutters. The locksmith had arrived. Travis had secured the front gates with heavy chains, wrapping the thick steel links around the wooden posts to fortify his tractor barricade. The locksmith approached the gate, moving methodically. The sharp clack of the bolt cutters snapping through the metal chains echoed sharply over the wind. The sound shattered whatever fragile restraint Travis still possessed. He realized the physical boundary was failing. The authorities were not retreating. The syndicate debt was due, and his final fortress was crumbling.
"Do not touch my property,"
Travis shrieked, sprinting down the porch steps. He closed the distance between the house and the gate in seconds. The locksmith took a cautious step backward, raising his hands. A young deputy stepped into the gap, attempting to intercept the charging homeowner. Travis did not slow down. Driven by raw panic, he lunged forward, throwing his weight into the officer. He shoved the deputy hard against the metal flank of the combine. Assaulting a sworn law enforcement officer is the fastest way to end a negotiation. The reaction was instantaneous. The second deputy moved with practiced precision. He grabbed Travis by the collar of his thin dress shirt, twisting his balance and sweeping his legs. Travis fell hard. His face slammed into the slush and frozen mud covering the driveway. The impact forced a sharp gasp from his lungs. 3 deputies descended upon him, pressing their knees into his spine and pinning his arms behind his back. The metallic ratchet of steel handcuffs snapping closed carried through the crisp night air. It was a beautiful, definitive sound. It mirrored the precise click of the brass deadbolt Travis had slid shut in my face just days prior.
"Let me go!"
he wailed, struggling uselessly against the overwhelming weight of the officers.
"I own this farm. You are stealing my life!"
The deputies hauled him to his feet.
His designer shirt was ruined, smeared with dark, freezing mud. His face was scraped and bleeding from the gravel. The arrogance that had fueled his cruel lockout was entirely extinguished, leaving only a pathetic, terrified shell. Sheriff Jensen ordered his team to secure the perimeter. A tow truck operator began the arduous process of moving the heavy farm machinery out of the access path. The barricade was dismantled piece by piece, restoring the rightful order of the estate. Another team of officers moved toward the front door to extract Natalie, who had finally dropped her phone and surrendered to the inevitable reality of her ruined social status. Gideon unrolled his window, resting his elbow on the doorframe. He watched the deputies march Travis toward the line of parked cruisers. The attorney offered a low, appreciative hum. "The trap worked flawlessly," he murmured. I kept my eyes fixed on my stepson. The deputies guided Travis toward the rearmost patrol car. They opened the rear door and pushed him into the molded plastic back seat. The officer slammed the door shut, sealing Travis inside the vehicle. Then the deputy did something remarkable. He did not return to the driver's seat. He did not start the engine. He simply walked away to assist with the tractor removal, leaving the cruiser parked in the dark. The engine remained off. The heater was not running. Travis sat alone in the back of the squad car, wearing nothing but a mud-soaked dress shirt. The ambient temperature was hovering right at the freezing mark, and the dampness of his clothing accelerated the chill. Through the plexiglass window, I could see his shoulders beginning to shake. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by the biting, unforgiving cold. I stepped out of Gideon's vehicle, the slush crunching softly beneath my boots. I walked slowly toward the edge of the police perimeter, stopping just outside the radius of the flashing lights. I wanted a clear, unobstructed view. Travis pressed his face against the cold glass of the patrol car window. He saw me standing there. The streetlights illuminated my heavy winter peacoat and the calm, detached expression on my face. He was shivering uncontrollably. His teeth chattered, his breath fogging the glass in rapid, frantic puffs. He wrapped his handcuffed arms around his torso desperately, trying to conserve whatever fragile body heat remained. The thin fabric of his shirt offered zero protection against the creeping frost. He was experiencing the exact agony he had weaponized against me on the night of his father's funeral. He had orchestrated a calculated plot to freeze me out of my own legacy. He had stripped my truck of survival gear, hoping the lethal drop in temperature would break my spirit. Now, the universe was balancing the ledger. He was locked inside a metal box, unable to escape, shivering in the dark, while the true owner of the estate watched him suffer. Our eyes locked across the distance. He did not look defiant anymore. He looked hollow. He realized in that freezing, isolated moment that he had never held any real power. He was simply a desperate pawn who had picked a fight with an auditor who kept the receipts. I did not smile. I did not offer a victorious wave. I simply stood in the damp winter wind, watching justice settle over the frozen landscape like a heavy, indisputable blanket. The physical confrontation was finished. The barricades had fallen. The only task remaining was the courtroom demolition, where the final remnants of his syndicate lies would be dragged into the unforgiving light of day. The heavy mahogany doors of District Courtroom 4 swung shut, sealing the chamber in a pristine, suffocating quiet. 72 hours had passed since the flashing police lights illuminated my gravel driveway. I sat beside Gideon Croft at the defense table, resting my hands flat against the polished wood grain. The air smelled of floor wax and ancient leather. I felt no anxiety. I was merely an auditor, waiting to present the final, catastrophic ledger. Travis sat 15 feet away at the plaintiff table. His bespoke, tailored suits were gone, replaced by a shapeless, bright orange county jail jumpsuit. The harsh fluorescent overhead lights highlighted the dark, bruised circles under his eyes,
and the angry red abrasion along his jawline from his encounter with the frozen mud. His wrists were secured in heavy steel cuffs, resting awkwardly on the table. He stared blankly at his chained hands, looking hollowed out and fragile. Behind him in the gallery sat Natalie. Her complexion resembled damp ash. The designer cashmere she favored was replaced by a plain dark blouse. She gripped the wooden pew in front of her, trembling visibly. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for a lifeline that did not exist. Judge Eleanor Caldwell presided over the bench. She was a veteran magistrate possessing zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics. She adjusted her silver reading glasses and opened the thick case file. She noted the temporary restraining order application, reading the sworn affidavit where Travis claimed I had threatened his wife with a hunting rifle during a psychotic break. The overworked public defender assigned to Travis stood up. He stammered through a brief opening statement, attempting to maintain the narrative of a terrified son protecting his family from a hostile intruder. He asked the court to make the injunction permanent. Gideon stood smoothly buttoning his suit jacket. He did not raise his voice. He commanded the room with a calm, predatory authority. He requested permission to submit defense exhibits that would directly impeach the credibility of the plaintiff. Judge Caldwell granted the motion. Gideon walked toward the center of the room and engaged the digital overhead projector. The screen behind the witness stand glowed white. He placed the first document onto the glass. It was the 1998 certified county deed. Your Honor. Gideon began pointing to the illuminated text. The plaintiff claims my client was trespassing on his estate. However, this verified deed proves Melody Wood is the sole owner of the property under a joint tenancy with right of survivorship. Upon the passing of her husband, the title bypassed probate entirely. Travis Wood had zero legal authority to occupy the farmhouse. The domestic dispute he described in his affidavit was, in fact, a felony home invasion. The public defender frowned, flipping frantically through his meager file. He stood up, objecting, and citing the new last will and testament his client had submitted to the probate clerk. He argued that the newer document superseded the old deed. Gideon smiled, offering a chilling display of teeth. He slid the deed off the projector and replaced it with a stack of hospital charts. The will filed by the plaintiff is a crude forgery, Gideon stated, his voice ringing clear across the silent courtroom. He pointed to the date printed next to the signature on the fraudulent document. He then referenced the corresponding medical chart. On Tuesday, October 12th, Calvin Wood was admitted to the intensive care unit, suffering from severe hepatic encephalopathy. The toxins in his bloodstream caused asterixis, a condition resulting in violent, uncontrollable hand tremors. Gideon paused, letting the medical reality sink into the record. The man could not hold a paper cup of water without spilling it down his chest. He was physically incapable of grasping a pen, let alone executing a flawless legal signature. Judge Caldwell leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she scrutinized the projected medical records. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew palpably tense. But the deception runs much deeper than simple greed. Gideon continued sliding a new document onto the glowing glass. He projected the public abstract from the Bakken Energy conglomerate. Travis Wood presented this forged will to corporate attorneys representing a major oil extraction firm. He initiated a $1 million surface use lease, falsely claiming undisputed ownership of the land. He committed federal wire fraud across state lines. The only reason the Energy Corporation did not wire the funds was because my client filed a notice of pending action freezing the title. Travis slumped forward in his plastic chair, burying his face in his shackled hands. The public defender stopped taking notes, slowly lowering his pen. He realized his client had lied to him and led him into a professional slaughterhouse. Judge Caldwell face hardened into a mask of pure judicial fury. She despised perjury above all other offenses. To utilize her court to facilitate a fraudulent real estate scheme was an unforgivable insult to her authority.
Gideon was not finished. He reached into his briefcase and retrieved the final document. It was the financial ledger compiled by his private investigator. He placed it on the projector, illuminating the offshore routing numbers and the encrypted cryptocurrency exchanges. The court must understand the motive driving this staggering criminal conspiracy, Gideon stated, turning to face the judge directly. The plaintiff owes $300,000 to an illicit sports betting syndicate operating out of Fargo. The notary public who stamped the forged will is Veronica Blake, a known loan officer for this shadow organization. A sharp, guttural gasp echoed from the gallery. I turned my head slightly. Natalie had covered her mouth with both hands. Her eyes were wide with pure, unadulterated horror. Travis was cornered by ruthless underworld creditors, Gideon explained methodically, dismantling the last remaining fragments of the delusion. He forged the will and attempted to lease the land to pay his gambling debts. When the oil money stalled, he panicked. He fabricated the hunting rifle threat and filed this restraining order to keep my client away from the property while he brought black market appraisers onto the farm to liquidate $1 million worth of agricultural machinery. The silence following Gideon's declaration was absolute. The intricate web of lies, theft, and desperation lay exposed under the harsh fluorescent lights. Travis had attempted to weaponize the legal system, but Gideon had turned the courtroom into a lethal trap. Judge Caldwell struck her wooden gavel against the sounding block. The sharp crack echoed like a gunshot. "This temporary restraining order is dismissed with extreme prejudice," she declared, her voice dripping with venom. "The claims outlined in this affidavit are demonstrably false." She turned her fierce gaze toward the plaintiff table. "Travis Wood, you have perjured yourself in my courtroom. You have submitted fraudulent documents in an attempt to manipulate the judicial process. I am ordering the bailiff to remand you into immediate custody without bail. I am formally referring this entire matter, including the forged estate documents and the attempted corporate lease, to the district attorney office. You will be facing charges for felony forgery, perjury, and federal wire fraud." 2 armed bailiffs stepped forward, grabbing Travis by the shoulders and pulling him to his feet. He did not struggle. He offered no protests. The realization that he was going to spend the next decade in a federal penitentiary had completely paralyzed his vocal cords. They marched him toward the side door leading back to the holding cells. As the heavy door clicked shut behind the prisoner, the true collateral damage of the conspiracy materialized. Natalie collapsed against the wooden pew, sobbing uncontrollably. The illusion of her wealthy elite life had shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. She had spent the last week boasting on social media, buying designer wardrobes and ordering custom horse trailers on high-interest retail credit. She believed she was marrying into a massive agricultural dynasty. Instead, she was married to a convicted felon who possessed 0 assets. But the loss of her social status was merely the beginning of her nightmare. The $300,000 syndicate debt did not magically disappear just because Travis went to prison. The offshore lenders still wanted their money. They possessed her home address, they knew her phone number. The shadow creditors would be coming for her next, demanding payment for the wagers her husband had lost. I sat quietly at the defense table watching the tearful ruin of the woman who had spent days trying to destroy my reputation. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. They had assumed my quiet nature was an invitation for exploitation. They failed to realize that when an auditor uncovers a discrepancy, they do not stop digging until the ledger is perfectly balanced. The drive back to the farmhouse felt entirely different from the agonizing journey I had taken 72 hours prior. The Chinook wind had done its work, reducing the jagged snowbanks to dark, fertile mud. The winter sun hung high in the pale sky, casting a warm golden light over the sprawling Great Plains.
I drove my pickup truck down the rural highway, listening to the tires hum against the wet asphalt. There were no flashing police lights waiting for me. There were no heavy agricultural machines blocking the entrance. The gravel driveway lay open and clear. I parked the truck in its rightful spot near the front walkway. I stepped out, letting my boots sink slightly into the thawing earth. The air smelled of wet pine and raw soil, carrying the distinct promise of an early spring. I walked up the wooden steps to the front porch, stopping at the exact location where I had stood, shivering in my thin black funeral dress. A commercial locksmith knelt before the heavy oak door. He was a burly man, wearing a faded canvas jacket, meticulously installing a high-security brass cylinder into the wood. I had hired the best contractor in the county, instructing him to replace every single entry point with hardware that could withstand a battering ram. The locksmith finished tightening the final mounting screws and stood up, wiping grease from his hands with a blue shop towel. He handed me a ring containing 3 pristine silver keys. "You are all set, Mrs. Wood," he said, his voice rough but respectful. "Nobody is getting through those without industrial cutting torches." I thanked him, paying his invoice in cash. I watched his service van back down the driveway and disappear down the county road. I stood alone on the quiet porch, holding the keys. I slipped the primary key into the newly carved brass cylinder. It turned with a smooth, flawless glide. I pushed the door open and stepped across the threshold into my own home. The interior looked like a physical manifestation of a psychological collapse. Travis and Natalie had treated the farmhouse like a bunker during their final days of panicked isolation. The hardwood floors were scuffed and stained with dried mud from Travis pacing in his heavy boots. Empty champagne bottles littered the expensive mahogany dining table, remnants of the premature celebration that had ultimately doomed them. Torn cardboard boxes from high-end designer boutiques overflowed the trash bins near the kitchen island. I walked slowly through the rooms, surveying the damage. A lesser woman might have wept at the sight of her sanctuary disrespected and trashed. I felt zero sorrow. I felt only the profound satisfaction of an auditor viewing a closed ledger. The mess was temporary. The victory was permanent. I took off my pea coat, draping it over the hallway coat rack. I walked into the kitchen, retrieved a heavy-duty trash bag from the pantry, and began the methodical process of cleaning. I moved from room to room, gathering the empty bottles, the discarded retail tags, and the remnants of their fabricated elite lifestyle. With every piece of trash I threw into the bag, I erased a fraction of their existence from my property. My mind drifted toward the county detention center located 30 miles away. Travis was currently sitting in a cold, concrete holding cell, wearing a bright orange jumpsuit. The federal prosecutors had formally filed charges for wire fraud and forgery. The bail was set at an unpayable sum. He was staring at a minimum sentence of 10 years in a federal penitentiary. The arrogant heir who thought he could seize a farm through sheer entitlement was now sharing a metal toilet with repeat offenders. He had traded a comfortable life for a decade behind bars because he refused to respect the power of legitimate paperwork. Natalie had fared no better. I received a brief phone call from Gideon Croft earlier that morning, detailing her sudden departure. The moment the gavel fell and Travis was remanded into custody, she sprinted from the courthouse. She did not return to the farm. She knew the shadow syndicate lenders were watching the proceedings. When the offshore bookmakers realized their collateral was gone and their pawn was imprisoned, they immediately shifted their collection efforts to the wife. Vance, the private investigator, reported that 2 men wearing dark suits visited Natalie's leased townhouse in Fargo before sunrise. They repossessed her luxury sport utility vehicle, her designer wardrobes, and any liquid assets they could locate. Stripped of her digital status and drowning in her husband's lethal gambling debt, Natalie packed a single duffel bag and boarded a westbound bus. She fled the state, terrified of the very underworld connections she had unknowingly married into. Her social media profiles, the same platform she had utilized to launch her vicious smear campaign against me, were deleted and wiped from the internet. She had become a ghost, running from a shadow. I finished scrubbing the kitchen counters, wiping away the last sticky residue of spilled wine. The farmhouse smelled of lemon polish and fresh air drifting in through the open windows. The structure felt clean, grounded, and restored to its original purpose. I walked down the hallway and entered Calvin's private study. The room remained untouched. Travis had been too busy fortifying the front door to bother plundering his father's desk. The walls were lined with agricultural awards, topographical maps, and framed photographs of our early harvests. I sat down in the worn leather executive chair, resting my hands on the smooth cherry wood surface. I opened my leather tote bag and pulled out the heavy black binder. I placed it on the desk, extracting the notice of pending action I had filed with the county clerk. The title freeze had served its purpose, trapping Travis in a financial vice and stalling his fraudulent transaction. Now that the forged will was destroyed and my sole ownership was legally verified on the public record, the freeze was no longer necessary. I picked up the telephone resting on the desk corner and dialed the direct line to the corporate legal department at the Bakken Energy conglomerate. I bypassed the low-level customer service representatives, utilizing the specific extension Gideon had provided. An executive landman answered the call, his tone cautious and formal. "This is Melody Wood," I stated, identifying myself. "I am the sole legal owner of the 600-acre parcel located on the Western Ridge. The fraudulent title claim filed by Travis Wood has been dismissed by a district judge. The perpetrator is in federal custody." I heard the frantic tapping of a keyboard through the receiver as the corporate representative verified the updated court dockets. A long exhale echoed across the line. "We see the updated abstract, Mrs. Wood," the landman replied, his tone shifting to a deferential professional cadence.
We apologize for the confusion regarding the previous applicant. The Energy Corporation is still highly interested in securing the surface use agreement for your parcel.
"I am willing to lift the notice of pending action," I countered, leaning back in the leather chair. "But the terms of the lease are going to change. You are no longer dealing with a desperate gambling addict willing to accept the first offer to save his own skin. You are dealing with an agricultural auditor. I want the signing bonus increased by 20% to account for the inconvenience. I want strict environmental protections written into the drilling contract to preserve my soil chemistry. And I want royalty percentages adjusted in my favor." There was a brief silence on the line. The corporate agent realized he was negotiating with a woman who held all the leverage and possessed the intelligence to use it. "We can draft the revised contracts and send them over for your review by tomorrow morning," he conceded. I disconnected the call, placing the receiver back onto its cradle. I had not merely protected my property, I had optimized it. I had secured a multi-generational fortune on my own terms, ensuring that the land would remain profitable and protected long after I was gone. I walked back into the pristine kitchen and brewed a fresh pot of dark roast coffee. The rich, earthy aroma filled the quiet house, replacing the last lingering memories of the cold winter lockout. I poured the steaming liquid into a heavy ceramic mug, feeling the comforting heat radiate through my palms. I carried the mug to the front living room, standing before the large bay window. The sun was dipping toward the western horizon, painting the thawing Badlands in vibrant shades of gold, crimson, and deep violet. The snow was almost entirely gone, revealing the rich, dark soil waiting for the spring planting season. I stepped over to the front door, examining the new brass deadbolt. I reached out and turned the heavy latch. Click. The sharp, satisfying sound of the locking mechanism sliding perfectly into the reinforced steel frame resonated through the entryway. It was the sound of true, undeniable security. It was the sound of a perimeter permanently sealed against arrogance, entitlement, and greed. I took a slow sip of the hot coffee, letting the warmth spread through my chest. Travis thought true power was about shouting the loudest and demanding respect through intimidation. He believed the woman standing quietly in the cold was a weak target waiting to be discarded. He learned the hard way that true power is silent. It lives in the meticulous verification of a county ledger. It lives in the quiet assembly of a secure evidence binder. It lives in the unyielding patience of a woman who knows exactly what she owns and exactly how to protect it. I stood in my own home, looking out over my own land, safe, secure, and entirely unbreakable. I sit at the heavy cherry wood desk in Calvin's study, watching the winter thaw through the frosted glass of the bay window. The profound silence of the farmhouse is no longer a battleground of shattered locks and forged documents. It has transformed into a quiet, echoing classroom. When I watched the county sheriff's cruiser fade into the desolate North Dakota night, carrying my stepson away to what will inevitably be a decade of federal confinement, I did not feel the triumphant, hollow rush of vengeance. Instead, I felt a deep, agonizing sorrow for a father who loved his boy entirely too much to save him. In modern American culture, we are intensely obsessed with the concept of the family legacy. We toil in frozen fields, commute through gridlocked cities, and sacrifice our own physical comfort to build an impenetrable fortress of wealth for our children. But the tragedy of Travis Wood reveals a terrifying truth about what happens when we prioritize the transfer of physical assets over the transmission of moral character. The soil of the Great Plains is brutally unforgiving. It demands a rugged, unyielding work ethic from anyone who wishes to extract a living from its frozen crust. You cannot negotiate with a blizzard, and you cannot manipulate a summer drought. The earth demands absolute honesty. If you do not plant the seeds correctly, you will not reap a harvest. This environment inherently teaches fairness through the strict, immutable laws of nature. Calvin inherently understood this relationship with the earth, yet he tragically failed to apply those same immutable laws of cause and effect to his own flesh and blood. He tried to build a protective greenhouse around a boy who desperately needed to feel the bite of the frost. Calvin was a good man, a hard-working farmer who believed that providing endless financial security for his family was the ultimate expression of devotion. But somewhere along the line, the boundary between providing and enabling became fatally blurred. In our traditional culture, there is an unspoken, pervasive pressure to give our children the life we never had. We want to shield them from the biting wind, both literally and metaphorically. Yet in our desperate attempt to remove the sharp obstacles from our children's paths, we often accidentally remove the very friction required to build their moral traction. Travis grew up watching his father operate heavy machinery, balance complex ledgers, and bleed for the soil. However, Travis was never forced to bleed for anything himself. His hands remained soft, his bank accounts were quietly subsidized, and his mistakes were absorbed by a patriarch who mistook constant rescue for fatherly affection. When we examine the traditional family structure, we often romanticize it as a place of unconditional comfort. However, unconditional love does not equate to unconditional approval. A parent's most profound responsibility is to cultivate emotional awareness within their child. This means teaching them how to process failure without resorting to blame, how to manage desire without descending into greed, and how to face inadequacy without turning to deceit. Travis lacked this crucial emotional vocabulary. When he lost his money to the offshore sports betting syndicate, his emotional immaturity left him utterly unequipped to handle the shame. Because he was never taught how to fall gracefully and accept the consequences of his actions, he chose to orchestrate a sprawling, multi-tiered criminal fraud rather than admit a single honest mistake to his family. The foundation of a healthy, enduring family structure does not rest on granite countertops, luxury sport utility vehicles, or multi-million-dollar Bakken oil leases. It rests on the unyielding bedrock of honesty, fairness, and accountability. When a child learns early on that tears, tantrums, or manipulation can bypass the consequences of their actions, a highly dangerous seed is planted. The tragedy of the forged will and the midnight equipment fences was not born in a dark alley in Fargo. It was born in the small, seemingly insignificant moments of Travis's childhood. It sprouted on the days he skipped his chores and faced no reprimand. It grew on the afternoons he lied about his responsibilities and received a new truck anyway. Every time his father absorbed the cost of his son's poor behavior, he was unknowingly signing a promissory note to a much darker future. We frequently mistake these small acts of parental leniency for grace, but in reality, they are acts of developmental sabotage. True family responsibility is an incredibly heavy burden because it often requires us to be the antagonist in our children's story for a brief time. It demands that we look our children in the eye and say no, allowing them to experience the agonizing, necessary sting of their own poor choices. We must teach them that fairness is not about getting an equal share of the pie just because of your last name. It is about receiving exactly what your labor and integrity have earned. A child raised without this emotional awareness becomes a hollow vessel, easily corrupted by the first shadow syndicate or illicit temptation that promises a shortcut to the top. We must realize that guiding a child is a lifelong marathon of enforcing boundaries, demanding absolute honesty, and demonstrating that integrity is far more valuable than inherited acreage. Watching Natalie's entire identity shatter in that courtroom was a secondary tragedy, a stark reminder of the collateral damage caused by unchecked entitlement. She married an illusion, a fragile facade built by a man who possessed no internal compass, and she paid the price for his lack of character. As a society, we must do better. We must stop raising children who know the price of everything and the value of nothing. If this journey through the frozen badlands of North Dakota resonated with you, if it sparked a sudden realization about the boundaries in your own life, or the lessons you are passing down to the next generation, I invite you to join our community. Subscribe to Samantha Told Stories, hit the like button, and share your thoughts in the comments below. We explore the darkest corners of family dynamics and the brightest triumphs of the human spirit, and you will not want to miss the next reckoning. Now, sitting in the quiet aftermath of the storm, I am left with a terrifying, counter-conventional realization. Modern society insists that the greatest tragedy a parent can face is leaving their child with absolutely nothing. We are terrified of our children experiencing poverty, struggling to pay a mortgage, or facing the brutal elements of the world alone. But that is a lie. The greatest tragedy is not leaving your child with nothing. It is leaving them with everything they have not earned. When you hand an unearned empire to a boy who has never built a single brick of it himself, you are not giving him a sanctuary. You are giving him a loaded weapon and turning off the lights. The most profound inheritance a parent can leave is the grit to survive a winter lockout, the honesty to face a ruined ledger, and the integrity to stand tall when the shadows close in. If you leave them that, they will never truly need your money. If you do not, all the money in the world will not keep them out of chains. Look closely at your own legacy. Not the one written in your bank accounts, but the one etched into the character of those who will carry your name.